A person believes they will never forgive their attackers. Thunder rumbles and lightning flashes. They find themselves in a forest, with rain pouring down, the drops running under a statue of a man reaching toward the sky. The person can't move and wonders how long it's been. They question if their end has come. Their mind is racing with too many questions, overwhelmed by panic and fear. They remember being humiliated in front of other students who mocked them, asking why they even bothered with school. They spent all their days at school because they had a useless skill. The memory of their only friend at school admitting they were tired of pretending to care haunts them. Feeling terrible, they didn't realize they were being deceived, even by this so-called friend. Someone decided to test new magic on them, turning them into an immobile statue. Now frozen in stone, they have no idea how much time has passed. Unable to track time, their thoughts are consumed by everything that has happened to them. They grit their teeth, repeating over and over that they hate everyone and everything. They're done with it all. They're determined not to continue living this way. A strong aura surrounds them as they resolve to take revenge on all their tormentors. They won't stop until their abusers get what they deserve. These abusers have done countless cruel things. God help them. Once, this person was a student at Zenthark Magic School, where they trained heroes to defeat the Demon King who attacked villages and wiped out heroes. The students at this school learned magic and various spells. Each had a unique ability like invisibility, shield creation, fire control, and more. The schoolyard was filled with teenagers. A red-haired boy mocked a blonde boy, punching him in the stomach and demanding to know when he would leave the school. The blonde boy, Abel, fell to the ground, clutching his stomach, shaking. Abel was always the target of ridicule because he didn't stand out. He had no skill. The redhead yelled that they were studying at the greatest magic school, a place for the true elite. He clenched his fist, saying there was no room for weaklings like Abel. Abel closed his eyes, bracing for the punch, but instead, a shield appeared in front of him, protecting him. For a moment, he felt safe. The blonde boy, Stark, was the one who created the shield. Stark asked if everyone at the school truly aspired to be heroes and if they behaved like this. When Stark appeared, everyone else cursed and left. Stark offered Abel a hand to help him up, saying that anyone would have done the same. Stark invited Abel to the school roof. There, Stark asked why Abel didn't defend himself. Abel laughed, an unexpected reaction. Stark watched him closely. Abel admitted that the bullies were right. His ability was useless. Stark asked if Abel really had the ability to decode spirits. Abel confirmed it, explaining that nothing significant happens because of it. A strange white screen just appears over his head. Abel mentioned that there was no record of his ability in the school library, no documents, textbooks, or articles that explained it. He remembered how he accidentally acquired the ability as a child, catching a spirit in the forest. Since then, his life had gone on as usual, and he hadn't done anything special with it. Abel said he had no desire to be a hero. He didn't need it. Stark thought about it and suggested that Abel's ability might not be so simple, that there was something special about it. But Abel doubted it. He couldn't believe his ability would ever be useful. He talked about a promise he made to a childhood friend to return to their hometown after graduating. Stark asked who this girl was and put a hand on Abel's shoulder, saying he wanted to team up with Abel to become adventurers and heroes, believing they could defeat monsters together. Abel sighed, thinking it was impossible. Yet, in that moment, he believed he could always trust his friend Stark. That day had been bright and sunny, with no signs of trouble, but fate had other plans. A man dressed in white stepped onto a stage in front of a large crowd of students to deliver important news. The man announced that the day before, they had received a vision. The students were intrigued as the man explained that the school council had decided to select a group of heroes to challenge and defeat the Demon King. The students were moved, and Abel couldn't believe it. He thought Stark would be perfect for this role. The man continued, announcing that the next heroes would be the Dark Wizard Black Lonanoa, Paladin Aiden, and Warrior Monk Gordon. Heroes who had already proven themselves with exceptional abilities and a real chance at victory. Abel was happy that Stark had been chosen as one of those who would go to fight the Demon King. Stark was perfect for the role, and Abel had long wanted to see his friend's skills shine. The man continued speaking and announced that Abel would be the last to join the group with his decryption ability. Abel was stunned. He couldn't believe he had just been called. He thought he must have misheard. Many of the students wondered why he was chosen, believing his ability was useless. Someone in the crowd even questioned where his skills could be of any use. The students who were selected were equipped and prepared for the battle. The next morning, they were already on their way to defeat the Demon King, confident that the vision couldn't be wrong. All the chosen students headed towards the Demon King's fortress, with Abel trailing behind. He really didn't want to be part of this, but he had no choice. Abel felt completely useless and couldn't understand why he had been chosen. He thought about leaving before it was too late, fearing he might not not survive if he encountered monsters or the Demon King himself. Abel turned to Stark, trying to tell him about his decision to leave, hoping for understanding from Stark, who had always been by his side and supported him. Stark had been his only friend at school, but to Abel's shock, Stark responded with a harsh punch. Abel didn't understand what was happening. Stark grabbed him by the collar and told him to address him properly. Abel was terrified. This wasn't the same friendly guy he had recently sat on the roof with. Stark lowered Abel to the ground and told him not to judge. Stark revealed that he had helped Abel get chosen for the group of heroes. Now that the mission had begun, Stark said he would treat Abel very differently. Stark declared that he couldn't stand weak people. Abel was devastated, unable to believe what he was hearing. He had thought they were friends, or at least good acquaintances. From that moment, things got worse for Abel. He was useless in battle, so he carried all the luggage and was used as a human shield. Abel was also the one sent to check for traps. The other members of the group didn't miss any opportunity to laugh at him. Everyone believed Abel was a burden to the team since his ability was useless in both frontline combat and defensive roles. Stark yelled at Abel for being too slow, saying he was only good for carrying things. Stark decided to punish Abel by leaving him to sleep in the street while they went to the casino. All the students were happy to leave, and Abel was left alone on the street with their belongings by a tree. Abel wondered why they treated him so badly. He couldn't understand what he had done to deserve this. He had never harmed anyone and had behaved as he should, yet everyone mocked him. Abel continued to wonder why he had been included in the group of heroes. The vision seemed strange to him, especially because he was in it. He didn't understand his role in all of this. Suddenly, thunder and lightning flashed in front of the students. A creature appeared, smiling wickedly, and asked if they were the heroes sent to fight him. Stark and Abel were shocked by its appearance. They weren't even halfway to the Demon King's fortress, so they weren't prepared for a battle, especially not against such a formidable opponent. The creature continued, saying it was a waste of his time and that he wasn't in the mood for a fight, especially not with school kids. This wasn't the level of the Demon King at all. The students couldn't believe the Demon King's hand had appeared right in front of them. They had never seen him in person and didn't know what to expect, but they knew the Demon King was powerful and possessed many spells. The Demon King smiled menacingly. Abel looked at him in horror, and from that moment, his hatred burned like the fires of hell. Stark, trying to clear his throat, couldn't believe they were facing such a powerful enemy. He had always considered himself elite, one of the strongest heroes at the school with impressive magic skills. But the Demon King easily defeated all the heroes, leaving them unconscious. Some began to recover slowly, but couldn't even rise from their knees to continue the fight or retreat to the school. Stark was kneeling in front of the Demon King, now fully aware of how terrifying he was. He hadn't expected to meet him so soon. The heroes were desperate to go home. Abel was crawling on the ground, staring at the Demon King, unable to comprehend how they had encountered him on the road. He was terrified and didn't want to meet his end. The Demon King floated in the air, hand on his chin, asking if these students were really supposed to be heroes. To him, they seemed weak and incapable of anything. He had expected more of a challenge. The Demon King decided that the students were too weak to be worth his time. He didn't even enjoy the encounter, so he decided to test his new magic on them, turning everyone to stone. The students tried to shield themselves, but their defenses were no match for the Demon King's power. Abel screamed as he saw a massive magic beam heading towards Stark. Without thinking, Abel ran towards Stark, pushing him out of the way and falling under the beam himself. Abel's entire body was encased in a hard armor and froze like a statue. He couldn't move or make a sound. He was completely immobilized. The Demon King looked down at the students in disgust as they fled. He couldn't believe they were heroes. Losing interest, he decided to return home. Abel, now paralyzed like a statue, was left terrified, unable to move. He tried to make sense of what was happening to him, but he was too petrified to think clearly. Despite everything he had endured, he still hoped that Stark and the others would come back to save him, though deep down, he knew it was unlikely after everything he had experienced during their journey. Remember how Stark and the other students looked at Abel with disdain, realizing they wouldn't come back to save him. Abel was sure of it because they had fled and weren't returning. Abel decided he had to deal with everything on his own. Suddenly, a huge screen with inscriptions appeared right in front of him. He stared at the screen in amazement, recognizing it as part of his spiritual ability. He tried to figure out what was happening. Abel touched the screen and wondered where all the text had come from. Before this, there had only been a white flash, and nothing else had ever activated his ability. He noticed an inscription about petrification magic, specifically the Gorgon's Gaze. He realized that this was the exact spell that had turned him to stone. Abel began to suspect that this was the Demon King King's magic. By activating his skills, Abel could start to decipher the spell's formula. He understood that if he could decode the formula, he could undo the petrification and even use the spell for his own purposes. But it wasn't that simple. Deciphering the complex magic of the Demon King was difficult with Abel's limited magical power. It would be a long process, especially since this was his first time attempting something like this. Abel couldn't decipher too many lines at once, as his magic power would run out, causing him to lose consciousness. The characters on the screen numbered over 10,000, a daunting task that would push him to the brink of exhaustion, forcing him to stop and recover before continuing. Abel grew weary from repeatedly performing this ritual, but over time, his magical power increased. The task was incredibly challenging, and Abel was visibly tense as he worked. He eventually took off his shirt and collapsed to the ground, cursing himself for agreeing to go to the Demon King's realm. He never wanted to be part of a group of heroes who hated him. Abel looked at a medallion and remembered Sarah, a girl from his hometown. He recalled how she gave him the medallion, saying it had protective powers, and asked him to return as soon as possible. Tightening his jaw in determination, Abel just wanted a peaceful life. He couldn't accept that Stark had abandoned him. He had thought Stark was his only true friend, but Stark turned out to be a traitor. Time passed, and Abel felt like he was losing his mind. He had wild thoughts and couldn't tell how much time had passed or whether he should continue deciphering the spell. But Abel clenched his fist and resolved to take revenge on those who had wronged him, even if it took decades. He would emerge and exact his vengeance. Eventually, Abel lost all sense of time. From time to time, he would return to the task of deciphering the spell. Finally, he focused on the last symbol. After a few moments, it too was deciphered like all the others. It seemed his work was done, and something was about to happen. The decryption was complete. The screen in front of him began to glow brightly. Blinded by the intense light, Abel opened his eyes to find himself back in the real world. He was still standing in the field, unable to move. But then, he began to feel the hard shell covering his body crumble away. He felt himself becoming freer. When the last of the shell was gone, Abel stood up and looked to the sky. Meanwhile, all eyes turned to him. One of the monsters saw Abel and licked its lips, deciding that he would be tastier than the girl they had been chasing. Another monster growled, expressing interest in anyone. They resumed their pursuit of the girl, eager to taste her. But as the monsters reached out to grab her, she screamed and cried, realizing she was trapped. Just then, a bright flash appeared behind the monsters, blinding them and forcing them to stop momentarily. Everyone froze, unable to move. They had all turned to stone. The chase was over, and the monsters hadn't even had time to reach the girl. The girl looked at the monsters in amazement, trying to figure out what was happening. It took her a moment to grasp the situation. Just a second ago, she had been on the verge of death. The monsters, now petrified, stared at Abel, realizing that he had used the Demon King's magic. The monsters surrounded Abel, one of them asking how he could use such complex spells. Another remarked that only the Demon King could wield such magic. One of the monsters prepared to attack, forming seals with its hands and launching a fire spell at Abel, shouting that he wouldn't be able to dodge the attack. The monster attacked wildly, without even aiming, but Abel created a shield, protecting himself from the fiery assault. He managed to hold off the attacks for a while, much to the monster's surprise. Couldn't understand why its most powerful spell had failed. Before the monster could attack again, Abel used the petrification spell once more. The monster screamed and tried to escape, but it was too late. Abel had already cast the spell. The monster couldn't believe that Abel could not only use the Demon King's magic, but also block it. The remaining monsters were stunned, all turned to stone. They tried to figure out who Abel was. In that moment, Abel realized how his decoding ability worked. First, it allowed him to dismantle and nullify the magical formulas of spells, a highly useful skill. Second, it enabled him to use any magic he had decoded. Having deciphered the complex magic of the Demon King, Abel now found it easy to decode ordinary magic. The lower demon spells were no longer a threat to him. He could decode and use them against his enemies effortlessly. Abel's magical power had grown significantly due to the constant strain of decoding the Demon King's spell, allowing him to reach incredible heights. Through his tireless work with decoding, Abel had become perhaps the most powerful magician in the world. Now, he could decode any spell and make it his own. With this ability, he would be able to defeat the Demon King himself. Armed with this power, Abel was determined to reach incredible heights and exact his revenge on those who had wronged him. A girl, who had escaped from some monsters, approached Abel. She stood in front of him and thanked him for saving her. She was overjoyed at being rescued, as she still had family in her village. Abel stared at her for a moment before asking a question. Where were the heroes now? He was desperate to find any information information he could about them. At first, the girl didn't understand which heroes he was talking about. Then she remembered and told him she had heard a story about how the Demon King had captured them all. But that had happened 20 years ago. Abel couldn't believe it. 20 years had passed? He was shocked. After a moment, he stepped back from the girl and asked if it was true that he had been turned to stone for 20 years. The girl began walking down the road, turning back to beckon him to follow her, saying they would soon reach the village. To get his attention, the girl called out his name. At that moment, Abel looked down at the ground beneath his feet and reflexively followed her. He was overwhelmed by his emotions. The boy was stunned when the girl told him that 20 years had passed since the heroes had lost to the Demon King and fled, leaving the world under his control. Most of the survivors had become slaves of the Demon King's army, and in rare cases, they lived on the outskirts of the land. People ran and hid from the Demon King's forces, with many seeking refuge in remote corners while the monsters searched everywhere. No one could believe that the heroes had abandoned them to their fate. The girl suddenly turned to Abel and realized she hadn't introduced herself. She told him her name was Layla and thanked him again for saving her. Layla couldn't believe how strong Abel was. She thought he might be one of the heroes. She hoped that he would help her and her village, maybe protect them from the monsters again. She asked if Abel was part of the group of heroes. Abel, taken aback, shouted, scaring Layla. He asked how she could think he was part of that group of vain, terrible people. Layla hid behind a nearby cave and apologized, saying she didn't mean to offend him. Abel sighed, not expecting to have frightened her so much, but the reminder of the heroes had deeply upset him. Abel placed a hand on his chin and apologized to Layla, admitting that he had lost his temper due to stress. He told her he didn't want to hear anything more about the heroes. Layla quickly agreed, jumping out from where she had been hiding and apologizing again. She approached Abel to see if he had calmed down or was still angry. Abel became serious once more and asked Layla to stop. He decided to ask her another question. Abel remembered that Layla had mentioned one of the heroes was in her village. Layla turned and smiled, confirming that this was true. She recalled that the hero's name was Gordon, from the dwarf clan. It was Gordon who had come to her village and helped them for a while. Abel immediately remembered a short, red-haired student who always smiled. He recognized Gordon at once and was terrified. The dwarf had been one of the most unpleasant members of the group. Abel remembered how, during one of their stops, Gordon had approached him and punched him hard in the stomach while he was trying to catch his breath. The dwarf had mocked him, telling him how cruel he was. Gordon had then introduced himself, saying he wouldn't leave Abel's side and would train him until he became a strong hero. But Gordon's training methods were anything but healthy. Things only got worse for Abel. At the time, Abel had fled in pain, wondering what it all meant. To him, the dwarf's methods didn't seem like normal training. The sessions were brutal, and it took Abel a long time to recover after each one. The dwarf, however, demanded silence, not wanting to hear any excuses. He just wanted Abel to take all the blows without complaint, believing that this would make him strong. Gordon raised his voice, insisting that only the strongest had the right to be part of the hero group. He didn't believe Abel was worth anything to the team. The dwarf demanded a clear answer and unconditional obedience to his instructions. He told Abel to get up and practice his punches immediately. All the other members of the group admired the dwarf's skills, but for Abel, Gordon was the one who most often treated him like a punching bag. The dwarf never stopped, constantly testing Abel's strength and endurance. Abel would never forget Gordon's face, his brown eyes, and the smile that was always plastered on his face. Abel remembered with horror how the dwarf had tormented him and vowed to take revenge for all the harm Gordon had caused. He realized that Gordon didn't have the eyes of a warrior, but rather those of someone who enjoyed mocking the weak. Abel suspected that the dwarf only enjoyed watching the weaker ones grovel at his feet. Overwhelmed by the flood of memories, Abel became tense. Layla, who had been trying to bring him back to reality all this time, was worried about him. She leaned closer, smiling at him, and asked if he was okay. Abel couldn't speak at first, but then he muttered a response. He turned around and realized that the sun was about to set, suggesting that they should find shelter for the night. Since they hadn't yet reached the village, Abel and Layla decided it was wise to stop for the night. They were close, but it was better to be cautious. Abel reminded Layla that many monsters come out to hunt at night and warned her that they needed to stay vigilant if they didn't want to fall into a trap or be devoured. Abel and Layla sat around a fire, trying to keep warm. It was dark outside, so they decided to make camp. Continuing their journey in the dark didn't make sense, as monsters could attack them at any moment, and they also needed to rest. Abel asked Layla why she was so far from her village. She explained that she had ventured out to gather medicinal herbs for the villagers. Her mother had tried to stop her, but there were no herbs left near the village. Thinking about it, Abel decided to ask Layla how Gordon ended up in her village. He wondered if the dwarf was really fulfilling his duty as a hero or if he was just hiding. Layla smiled as she looked into the fire, explaining that Gordon was regarded as a bodyguard in her village. He protected the village from monsters. Abel suspected that Gordon was hiding in the village, living peacefully instead of risking his life to save others. Layla then asked why Abel was searching for members of the hero group. Abel sighed, saying it wasn't something that concerned her and that he didn't want to reveal his motives. After all, they had just met and he didn't fully trust her yet. Layla asked if she could try to guess, smiling as she said she was confident she could figure it out. She guessed that Abel wanted to defeat the Demon King, believing he intended to gather the surviving heroes and lead a rebellion against him. She argued that if Abel joined the heroes, the Demon King's reign would be numbered. She believed that a team of heroes could defeat the Demon King and bring peace back to the people. Abel's eyes widened in surprise, and he clenched his teeth in anger. He abruptly turned his back on Layla and demanded that she put out the fire, saying he was going to lie down. Layla, not asking any more questions, did as she was told. She took a pot of water, poured it over the fire, and then lay down on her sleeping bag. Abel lay down, staring at the wall of their makeshift shelter. For now, he wasn't concerned about the Demon King. His main goal was to take revenge on the heroes who had betrayed him and fled like cowards. He would never forgive them for that. Abel knew he needed strength to achieve his goal. Clenching his fist, he thought about how he would make the heroes pay for what they had done. Suddenly, his ability didn't seem so useless to him. He wanted the heroes to feel the same horror and fear that he had experienced during his petrification. Abel believed they deserved the same fate for their actions. He thought that his so-called useless ability was the only reason he had managed to escape. He never expected it to save him, especially since there had been no information about it and he had never used it before. Around Abel's neck hung a pendant given to him by a girl from the village. It glowed intensely, but at that moment, Layla was already asleep and didn't notice that Abel had the same necklace as hers. Abel himself hadn't yet realized the connection between Layla and Sarah. The next day, Layla and Abel set off again. Layla informed Abel that they were almost at their destination. She was eager to finally return to her village. She told him that they just needed to climb the mountain to see the entire village and then descend into it. That way, they would quickly reach home and see her mother. As they reached the top, Layla suddenly stopped and gasped. Abel, not understanding what had shocked her, only saw her looking at the village in horror, her mouth open as she tried to speak. Layla told Abel to look at the village. When he did, he too was shocked by what he saw. The village was on fire, reduced to rubble. People and monsters were running everywhere. Layla screamed in horror, asking what was happening. She saw people running and screaming, unable to believe that monsters were attacking her village. Desperately worried about her mother, Layla and Abel approached a man who appeared to be injured. Layla knelt beside him, asking if he was okay and what had happened. The man, bruised and battered, gathered his strength to respond and told them that the Demon King's army had attacked the village. He explained that the demons had come looking for Gordon, searching for the hero. Layla couldn't believe what she was hearing. She asked what all of this meant and where Gordon was. She had believed that the hero would save them, but now it seemed he was hiding somewhere while everyone else was trying to escape. Suddenly, Abel heard someone scream and turned around. He saw demons grinning and raising their weapons to attack the villagers, clearly enjoying the terror they were causing. The demons were smiling, one of them mockingly apologizing for the destruction they were bringing to the village. Another demon laughed, saying they would get a promotion for capturing one of the heroes. Nearby, an elderly woman sat on the ground, trying to calm a child who was sitting on her lap, telling him she would protect him. The child screamed in terror, frightened of the demons attacking his village. A demon sneered and raised his weapon to strike the defenseless victims. He was about to bring it down when something stopped him. Abel suddenly appeared between the demon and the grandmother with her grandchild. Using his petrification spell, Abel turned the demon to stone, freezing him in place before he could harm anyone. All the demons were taken aback, and the grandmother and her grandchild didn't understand what had just happened either. The monsters stared at Abel, trying to figure out who he was. They were furious that some random guy had dared to interfere with their raid on the village. The monsters attacked the villagers, who screamed and pleaded for help. One of the monsters ran up to the orc, bent over, and reported that reinforcements had arrived. The orc asked what had happened. All the monsters decided to focus their attack on Abel. Among them, the most important one, a red-haired monster with a scar, was holding a cage with a hostage inside. The orc looked at Abel and asked if he could really defeat his monsters. He remarked that his subordinates were useless, unable to defeat an ordinary person. Abel anxiously glanced at the monster and saw a haggard Gordon sitting inside the cage. The dwarf looked terrible and hadn't even tried to free himself, resigned to his fate. Gordon saw Abel and shouted in surprise, not expecting to see him again. Abel commented that the hero had changed a lot, jokingly asking if he had been on a diet. Gordon, sweating from the effort, had sweat dripping down his face as he tried to process the unexpected appearance of the schoolboy he and the other heroes had thrown into the battlefield against the Demon King. The orc raised the cage higher with Gordon inside and asked if they really knew Abel, intrigued by how he might use this information to his advantage. The orc wouldn't mind capturing another hero to earn a bonus. Turning to Abel, the orc asked if he knew that Gordon had tried to escape again, despite being a member of the hero group. The orc looked at Gordon with contempt and then back at Abel. The orc continued, saying that Gordon didn't even try to fight but surrendered immediately just to save his own life. He was certain that Gordon didn't have the qualities of a hero and was nothing more than a coward. Gordon, in response, turned to the monster, laughed, and asked if his life was so bad. Smiling, he insisted that his own life was all that mattered, believing that to be a reasonable stance. Gordon then yelled at Abel, saying that he didn't know how Abel had managed to survive, but in his opinion, Abel had no right to judge him. Abel looked at Gordon in disbelief, realizing that the hero was indeed a coward who only knew how to mock others. Abel approached the orc and asked why he needed Gordon, offering him a deal. Abel would let all the monsters go if Gordon didn't want to fight. The orc responded by striking Abel with his weapon, expressing his dislike for Abel's tone. The monster questioned whether Abel really thought he could defeat him and his subordinates. Abel dodged the blow as the orc continued, declaring that someone like Abel didn't have the strength to defeat him, especially since he was the only orc in the Demon King's army who could use magic. The orc formed a magical seal and sent a magical dragon toward Abel. Abel quickly created a shield with his ability, covering himself with it. Closing his eyes, Abel told the orc that the only thing he could boast about was his magic. At that moment, Abel found himself again in front of a huge screen with the text of spells. He was able to decipher a new spell, and with a gesture, he formed a magical seal. His hands lit up with green fire. A second later, a massive green magical dragon burst from his hand, heading straight for the orc. The orc froze in shock, astonished that Abel had used the exact same spell as him. He stared at the approaching magical dragon, sweating from the effort and unable to say a word, let alone counterattack. The dragon was too fast and powerful. A loud scream echoed as the orc, unable to dodge the attack, fell directly under the magical dragon's assault. The orc, overwhelmed by the powerful attack, had no choice but to start the battle. Gordon clung to the bars of his cage, screaming as the orc released it. The cage hurtled toward Abel, who caught it with one hand, holding it above his head. Gordon calmed down momentarily as Abel lowered the cage, apologizing to the orc. Abel explained that he hadn't wanted to fight. He had hoped to resolve things peacefully, but circumstances forced him into battle. Disappointed with the outcome, Abel remarked that the orc was no match for him. Gordon, still gripping the bars, looked at Abel in amazement, unable to believe how strong Abel had become. He remembered when Abel had a seemingly useless ability. Gordon couldn't close his mouth in surprise as he looked at where the orc had been, now just an empty spot covered in dust. The orc had been obliterated by Abel's attack, proving too powerful for him. Gordon wondered if this was really the same useless Abel. He smiled slyly, thinking he could persuade Abel to help him, believing that with Abel's power, he could ensure his own safety. Terrified, the other monsters fled the village, screaming in fear, trying to avoid Abel after witnessing their leader's defeat by a single magical spell. Gordon suddenly approached Abel. The dwarf looked at him seriously, still inside the cage, and leaned toward him, trying to appeal to Abel for his release. He acknowledged Abel's strength, admitting that it seemed limitless, and said he never expected Abel to become so powerful. Gordon recalled a completely different Abel, but now he had changed. The dwarf tried to convince Abel that he had finally opened his eyes and seen the true strength of the boy he once knew. He claimed that he had seen the potential in Abel during their campaign against the Demon King. But Abel was not impressed. He looked at Gordon, who continued to plead, swearing that he had changed. Gordon asked for forgiveness, calling Abel a true hero and promising to be loyal to him for the rest of his life. He believed that he had managed to placate Abel and that he would now be set free. Suddenly, the sound of creaking iron bars filled the air as Abel broke the bars of the cage. He grabbed Gordon by the throat and began to squeeze. The dwarf tensed up and started to choke, struggling to breathe as Abel tightened his grip. Gordon began coughing violently, and Abel, raising his voice, spoke harshly to the dwarf. He demanded to know if Gordon wasn't ashamed of his behavior. Abel was astonished by Gordon's audacity. He didn't consider Gordon a true hero and was filled with anger. He reminded Gordon how the dwarf had mocked him, looking down on him. Abel was was outraged that Gordon would dare to ask for mercy after all the harm he had caused. Tears welled up in Gordon's eyes, and he let out a cry, terrified by the situation. He couldn't recognize the person in front of him. Abel seemed angry and cruel, nothing like the boy who had once been too timid to confront the heroes. Abel tightened his grip on the dwarf's throat, demanding information about the rest of the group. He told Gordon that if he provided the information, there was a chance Abel might spare him. He didn't promise anything but insisted that the dwarf had to give him something, or it would be the end for him. Gordon, fearing for his life, hesitantly asked if Abel would really spare him if he gave up the information about the other heroes. He was desperate to stay alive and didn't want to meet his end this way. After a brief pause, Gordon began to spill everything he knew about the heroes and their whereabouts. Abel listened intently, waiting for his opportunity to take revenge on his tormentors. When Gordon finished, he smiled and laughed, asking Abel if he would let him go now that he had shared everything. Gordon assumed Abel was still the same soft, pathetic boy who would let him go. Abel lowered his head and, in a calm voice, said he would honor part of their agreement. Then, raising his head, he squeezed Gordon's throat even harder and told him that he would spare his life, but on one condition. Abel then used a new spell, forming a seal behind Gordon. The dwarf became frightened, slowly realizing that his body was being encased in a stone shell. Gordon screamed in terror, asking Abel what he was doing. Abel, with a cold expression, told him to enjoy the experience. Layla tried to intervene but was too late. Abel, at that moment, told Gordon that he would never forget what the heroes had done to him. While Gordon was being petrified, Abel spoke of how he had longed for the day of his revenge during his time as a stone statue. Layla watched in horror, unable to believe that Abel could be so cruel. Finally, Abel told Gordon that it was too late for apologies. With a smile, he said that the dwarf should feel the same fear and helplessness that Abel had felt when he was turned to stone. As Gordon's face froze in a terrified expression, his body was fully encased in stone. The statue toppled to the ground, and Abel stared at it. The villagers emerged from their hiding places, horrified by what had happened to Gordon. One resident tried to run to Gordon, concerned for him, but another stopped her, glancing warily at Abel, who had just confronted the Demon King's army. Amidst the commotion, Abel heard a woman running to Layla, who was crying out with joy that her daughter had survived. The woman began asking Layla if she was alright. Layla was overjoyed to see her mother. Abel turned around and was stunned. He recognized the woman, his childhood friend who had grown up. She was Layla's mother. Abel froze, staring at her in amazement. Approaching her, Abel hesitantly asked if her name was Sarah. The woman immediately recognized him and, visibly worried, ran to him, asking if it was really him and where he had been for so long. Abel couldn't find the words to respond. The woman began to cry as she moved closer to him. She told him it had been a long time since they had seen each other, and that she wanted to talk to him about many things, just like they used to. Abel remembered how, before he left for school, Sarah had given him a necklace and asked him to return as soon as possible. She had been his only close friend, and he had often thought about reuniting with her. As Sarah extended her hand, Abel, who had been looking down the entire time, took out the pendant and returned it to her, apologizing for not keeping his promise. Without another word, Abel turned and began walking away, determined to find the heroes. He didn't want to see his childhood friend again because he had failed to keep his promise and could no longer live as an ordinary person. As Sarah and Layla watched him walk away, Abel resolved to use his ability to take revenge on the heroes and the Demon King. He was determined, knowing he had many unpleasant confrontations ahead. Layla, watching Abel closely, suddenly bolted from her place and ran after him. Her mother called out to her, but Layla didn't hear and kept running. She didn't want to let Abel go just like that, especially after he had saved her and the village. Layla ran straight toward him. Meanwhile, a blonde girl observed everything through a magic orb. She saw that Abel was alive and not happy about it. She had thought he was still petrified, standing frozen in the middle of a vast field. The girl, sitting on a throne and holding several people in chains, smiled wickedly. She decided that Abel would become her next plaything. She couldn't let an old acquaintance escape. Abel had managed to protect Layla's village from the orc army. It hadn't been his intention, but the circumstances had forced him to intervene and save the villagers. More importantly, Abel had exacted revenge on one of the heroes, Gordon, one of the most unpleasant dwarves he had ever met. Abel didn't feel sorry for Gordon. He believed the dwarf deserved his fate. Now, Abel was on his way to find the others, already focused on his next target. Gordon had given Abel enough information about the other heroes, those who Abel was determined to take revenge on. The sun was shining brightly as Abel walked down a peaceful path by the lake. The calm and tranquility around him made his journey seem almost serene as he moved forward with purpose. But suddenly, Abel heard noises behind him. Layla was running after him, shouting for him to stop. She was breathless and exhausted, but she managed to catch up to him, trying to halt his progress. Abel turned to her, confused as to why she was chasing after him. After all, he had saved Layla's village and its people. She should have stayed with her mother instead of embarking on another dangerous adventure. When Abel stopped and turned around, Layla finally reached him, dropping to her knees and gasping for breath. She told him that she was relieved to have caught up with him, having feared she wouldn't make it in time. Abel asked why she had run after him. Layla, still catching her breath, placed a hand on her chest and declared that she would go with him. She was determined and awaited his reaction, ready to do whatever it took to join him. Abel looked at her in disbelief, unable to understand why she wanted to follow him. He was focused on his own goals that were much more significant to him than anything Layla could offer. He didn't believe she could help him in battle and refused her request, explaining that his journey would be long and dangerous. He insisted that she had no place on such a trip, as she would only be a hindrance and create problems. Abel shouted for her to go home, but Layla refused and shouted back, standing firm in her decision to stay. She tried to argue her case, insisting on her right to accompany him. Abel studied Layla closely and asked what had happened that made her so determined to join him. He pointed out that he had taken her home, which should have been enough. Layla was silent for a moment before confessing that she felt she would be alone for the rest of her life if she let him go. She didn't want him to be alone either, especially after he had saved her and the villagers. With sincerity, she took his hand and told him she couldn't leave him. Abel looked at her again, this time with a mix of surprise and contemplation. Layla then handed him the pendant, holding his hand to her chest, and told him that he must promise to return to her mother. Abel remembered Sarah's worried look and, after a moment of seriousness, he turned around and told Layla that she could do whatever she wanted. At first, Layla simply looked at him, then smiled, saying that's exactly what she was going to do. Together, Layla and Abel continued through the forest, climbing over rocks. During the climb, Layla, tired from trying to catch up with Abel and now exhausted from the steep ascent, asked why they had to climb the mountain. Just as she voiced her fatigue, wolves appeared at the top. Layla was terrified, and Abel noticed the wolves' predatory smiles. The girl froze in fear, waiting for the inevitable attack. One of the wolves lunged forward, growling as it closed in on her. Layla screamed, unsure of where to run. The mountain's terrain made it impossible to escape quickly, but Abel moved swiftly, positioning himself in front of her and using a spell to turn the wolf into stone. The other wolves paused for a moment before launching another attack, but Abel repeated the spell, petrifying the rest of the pack before they could reach Layla. Once again, Abel had saved her. However, Layla felt utterly useless, unable to do anything during the wolf attack. Abel turned to see her looking at him in horror, having witnessed the power he wielded. Layla screamed and ran in fear as Abel continued to use the petrification spell on the wolves. She darted from side to side, trying to escape, her fear overwhelming her. Abel, while handling the remaining monsters and animals they encountered along the way, couldn't immediately help Layla. As a result, she spent most of the time running and screaming, terrified. By the time evening came and darkness fell, Layla and Abel decided to rest. They reached a small lighthouse where they could sit comfortably and recover. Abel helped light a fire, and the two of them sat silently around it, the warmth and light from the flames offering some comfort. Layla sat on a log, looking very discouraged, feeling utterly useless. Abel tried to console her, telling her that he didn't need anyone else to fight and was confident he could handle everything on his own. But this wasn't what Layla wanted to hear. Resigned, she lowered her head. Abel, closing his eyes, told her that it would be better if she returned to the village, as the journey ahead would be dangerous, and she could get hurt. Layla thought for a moment, then suddenly lifted her head and smiled as an idea came to her that could simplify their journey. She brightened up and, smiling, suggested that if Abel could teach her magic, she wouldn't be a burden and could even help in fighting the monsters. She believed that, with some training, she could contribute and protect Abel while he was on the front lines. Abel wasn't enthusiastic about the idea and looked at her skeptically, telling her that he didn't want to take on such a gloomy task, especially during their journey together. But Layla persisted, taking his hand and insisting that if he taught her magic, she could be of some use in combat. She continued to plead, and after much persuasion, Abel finally agreed to become her teacher. He wasn't sure how he would do it, but he would teach her the basic skills she needed to fight. Layla was thrilled with the idea of learning magic from Abel, while Abel, on the other hand, sighed with fatigue. He hadn't expected to have to train someone during his journey, and he considered it an additional headache. Still, he found it odd that Layla had asked him to be her teacher. Layla assured him she would do her best, determined to learn, and her enthusiasm slightly swayed Abel, though he remained skeptical. Despite Despite his doubts, he hoped that training Layla might yield some positive results. Abel stood up and ended their conversation by putting out the fire. They decided to sleep, ensuring they were well rested for the challenging day ahead. Both Abel and Layla lay down in their sleeping bags and soon fell asleep. Since that conversation, Abel had been teaching Layla magic while they searched for the remaining members of the hero group. Layla was eager to follow Abel and obey him in everything, though Abel wasn't particularly impressed. Nevertheless, he continued his journey with his new companion. As they walked along the road, Abel mentioned that Layla had yet to awaken a unique ability, so he suggested they start with the basics. He stopped and began to teach her something new. Abel conjured a flame in his hand and explained that magical power was an energy that came directly from the human body. He moved his hand, demonstrating how he could hold the flame without harm. Abel added that emotions could either increase or decrease one's reserve of magical power, and particularly intense emotions could be difficult to control magically. Layla listened attentively, watching the flame in his hand. Abel then said they needed to see how well she could control magic in a calm state. He passed the flame to her, instructing her to try creating a fireball. Layla tried hard but couldn't succeed, becoming frightened when she couldn't remove the flame from her hand. Abel continued to instruct her, though he began to doubt her talent for magic. He thought that if she didn't improve, she wouldn't be much help in battle. But he still held out hope that Layla might learn something. Eventually, Abel and Layla approached a city near the sea. Abel stopped to look around, while Layla, exhausted from the constant traveling, tried to catch her breath. The two had arrived at the coastal city of Porto Largo, a place with two-story stone houses and several storefronts. The city was quiet, almost eerily so, and deserted. As they walked through the empty streets, Layla couldn't help but look around in curiosity. They encountered no one on their way. The city seemed abandoned. There was no sign of life in the houses or on the streets. Abel glanced toward the sea and noticed a small boat docked nearby. He remarked to Layla that it was strange for Porto Largo, usually a bustling place, to be so empty. Layla then explained that, even before she was born, the city had suffered a terrible catastrophe due to an attack by the Demon King's army, and since then, people had been too afraid to return. As they continued to explore, Abel noticed a teddy bear under one of the displays. He picked it up and saw that it was stained with blood, which he found disturbing. He couldn't imagine what had happened in the city. Tension built within him, and he clenched the toy tightly, grinding his teeth. Layla noticed his tension and called out to him, worried about what was bothering him. She didn't fully understand Abel's purpose or what was on his mind, knowing little about his past despite their time together. She wanted to get to know him better so they could become true companions. Without turning around, Abel said they needed to continue exploring the city. Layla didn't argue and followed him. They walked through the deserted streets, examining everything they came across. Abel assumed the city had been abandoned due to the monster attacks and didn't expect to find anyone or anything of significance. Suddenly, a blonde girl appeared around the corner, carrying a large basket of food. Abel and the girl locked eyes, both staring in disbelief. The girl stood frozen with her basket as Abel's eyes widened in recognition. He realized that the girl was a member of the hero group. Layla, noticing the girl's pointed ears and delicate features, realized she was an elf, something she had never seen before. Abel called out the girl's rank and name, White Wizard Lananoa. Lananoa, stunned, could only stammer Abel's name in response. She dropped the basket of food and ran toward Abel, clinging to him and begging for forgiveness. Layla watched in surprise as Abel looked at Lananoa, momentarily dazed and unsure of what to do. Lananoa placed a hand on her chest and apologized profusely for abandoning Abel and running away with the other heroes. She expressed deep regret for her actions. Layla, observing this interaction, began to piece together that Lananoa was indeed an old member of the hero group. She marveled at Lananoa's beauty and strength, noting her wavy blonde hair cascading down her back and her elven features. Suddenly, Layla called out to Abel, breaking the tense atmosphere. Abel, now on edge, formed a magical seal, preparing to use his petrification spell once again. He shouted at Lananoa, warning her not to touch him. Lananoa fell to the ground, trying to crawl away in fear. Abel, his voice filled with anger, was ready to turn her to stone. This was, after all, why he had come to the city. But just as he was about to cast the spell, Layla rushed toward Abel, desperately trying to stop him. Layla held onto Abel's shoulder for a moment, but when she realized how determined he was, she decided to try reasoning with him. She asked him to calm down, pointing out that the dwarf, Lananoa, was crying and apologizing. Layla emphasized that Lananoa was in a terrible state and shouldn't be harmed. Suddenly, a voice from the street shouted at Abel, asking him to stop. Many strangers emerged, looking at Abel with contempt. Layla quickly understood that they were residents residents of the coastal city, coming out to protect their master, Lananoa. The residents were clearly hostile toward Abel and ready to defend Lananoa at all costs. One of the residents asked Abel to stop the violence and demanded to know why he wanted to hurt their lady, Lananoa. They were prepared to protect her with their lives. Layla fell into a state of shock, while Abel looked around at the gathered crowd and then back at Lananoa. One of the residents began to explain how they all hid in the deepest part of the city, not far from the market, where Lananoa protected them from the monsters that attacked the city from time to time. Another resident confirmed this, adding that Lananoa was the goddess who safeguarded their city, saving all the inhabitants from the formidable monsters of the Demon King. The residents slowly approached Abel and Layla, pleading with them not to harm Lady Lananoa. They were serious, especially since Abel had scared their beloved mistress. A small boy even approached Abel and started hitting him with his fists, tears streaming down his face, saying he wouldn't let Abel hurt his sister. Even the child was willing to stand up for Lananoa. Lananoa, seeing the situation escalate, intervened and told everyone to stop. She placed a hand on her chest and admitted that Abel was an old comrade, acknowledging that she had treated him badly in the past. She confessed her guilt and told the whole truth, bowing her head and expressing deep regret for her past behavior. Lananoa explained that she had behaved terribly in the past, influenced by the company she kept, and she had lived with that regret her entire life. She admitted that she couldn't ask anything of Abel, but she wanted to atone for her sins. She begged Abel to give her another chance, waiting for his response with her head still bowed. Layla, after a moment of silence, told Abel that Lananoa didn't seem like a bad person. Although it was her first time meeting her, Layla had a positive impression of Lananoa. She also pointed out that the residents had the same opinion, worshipping Lananoa and being willing to defend her. Layla argued that this was a strong enough reason to forgive Lananoa. Abel was still very angry, but eventually decided to forgive Lananoa. He listened to Layla's reasoning and left the scene for a while to contemplate his decision regarding revenge on Lananoa. Night fell, and all the residents gathered in the streets. They set up tables with delicious food, covered them with cloths, and lit streetlights that beautifully illuminated the streets, creating a cozy atmosphere. The residents played various musical instruments, and many boys danced with the girls to the rhythm of lively, cheerful music. People gathered around the tables, watching as a skilled man prepared a huge fish. Lananoa was delighted with the festivities, while Layla sat down to enjoy the food, rejoicing at the feast. However, Abel was nowhere to be found. Feeling deceived, he had hidden away while the residents enjoyed the party. Lananoa eventually excused herself, saying she needed to step away for a couple of minutes to bring more delicious food. Layla thanked her for the sweets, as it had been a long time since she had eaten something so delightful. Lananoa smiled and went down an alley to fetch more food. But as she walked, someone grabbed her arm. Startled, she didn't have time to react before she was pushed against a wall and immobilized. It was Abel. He pressed Lananoa against the wall, telling her that he didn't believe her performance for a second. He still suspected a trap and couldn't trust that she had genuinely changed or felt remorse for her actions. Lananoa looked at Abel and, despite being pinned, smiled, remarking that after 20 years, Abel hadn't changed, even after spending all those years as a stone statue. She noted that he still had the same handsome face. Abel stared at her coldly and said that she hadn't changed either. He noted that, being an elf, her appearance remained the same, but he was more concerned with her inner nature, which he believed was still deceitful. Abel accused her of being a witch pretending to be an elf, convinced that he knew her true face. Lananoa looked at him carefully, recalling how, 20 years ago, she had used Abel for her own purposes. Although she hadn't mocked him as the other heroes did, she had still taken advantage of him. Abel remembered how, during their campaign, he was constantly subjected to physical labor, like pulling a large carriage in which Lananoa sat, fanning herself. He struggled to pull the carriage, especially when Stark, another hero, would mock him, praising Lananoa for her brilliant ideas. As Abel continued to pull the carriage, Lananoa, recalling her childhood cruelty, smiled as she prodded him to move faster, even using magic to inflict pain if he slowed down. Abel, exhausted and humiliated, endured the torment as the heroes inside the carriage laughed and made fun of him. Now, standing before her, Abel was filled with rage, remembering the cruelty of the past. He tightened his grip on Lananoa, who remained composed despite the situation, and told her that he would never forget how she had treated him. The heroes used to take pleasure in watching Abel struggle while they did nothing. During one of their stops, Abel decided to go to a nearby mine to collect water. He dipped a handkerchief into the water, reflecting on how it had been another disgusting day, one that made him want to go back. But suddenly, he heard a sound coming from a nearby cave. Curious, Abel got up and walked toward the cave to investigate the noise. As he approached, he overheard a conversation between between Lananoa and Stark. Lananoa asked if they were really going to the South Dungeon the next day, expressing fear of the many monsters and insects there. Abel, hidden from view, watched in astonishment, unable to move, as the scene unfolded before him. He observed as Lananoa leaned in towards Stark, suggesting they visit the casino instead. She promised to do something nice for him if he agreed, blushing as she made the offer. It became clear to Abel that Lananoa had feelings for Stark, but treated others similarly, using charm to manipulate them. One day, while walking around town, Abel saw Lananoa in an alley with Gordon. She was whispering something to him, and he laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. It was then that Abel realized Lananoa was seducing everyone to achieve her goals. She manipulated people, using them as she pleased. Abel was horrified as he understood that Lananoa controlled all the characters behind the scenes, playing with the heroes until they bored her, at which point she would simply discard them. To him, she was like a spider in a woman's body. Filled with rage, Abel confronted Lananoa, accusing her of putting on a performance to deceive him. He demanded to know if she really thought he would believe her. He was convinced that the villagers had fallen under Lananoa's influence, manipulating everyone in the city. Abel asked if she had truly become a spiritualist, while Lananoa, visibly concerned, pleaded with him to stop and tried to explain. Lananoa admitted that Abel could say whatever he wanted about her, but she insisted that he shouldn't speak ill of the villagers, who were very dear to her. She continued to try to convince him that she had changed. Suddenly, she raised her voice, crying as she explained that she was genuinely trying to atone for her sins. She revealed that it was in this coastal city that she had once been saved. Lananoa recalled the day they fled from the Demon King, how she had separated from the hero group and wandered alone through the desolate lands. During her lonely journey, she realized that the Demon King had taken over the world. She had to hide in corners, terrified just to survive. No one wanted to give her food, and everyone shunned her. Lananoa was overwhelmed by negative emotions she had never felt before, and at some point, she reached her limit, collapsing in this coastal city. She lay in the mud for a long time, feeling as though her end had come. But she didn't lose hope. Desperately, she begged the residents for water or food, only to be met with blank stares. Lananoa realized that in this new world, a cruel rule had taken hold, every person for themselves. She believed that since she was part of a defeated group, she didn't deserve even the most basic necessities. Then, unexpectedly, someone sat down in front of her and placed a plate with a piece of bread on it. Lananoa was stunned, staring at the bread with her mouth open. She couldn't understand why these people, who were also struggling, would share their food with her. It was a difficult time, with everyone suffering due to the hero's failure. The man who had given her the bread smiled and told her that she needed it more than they did. Lananoa was moved by the residents' kindness and began to cry. It was then that she fully realized how terrible she had been all along. She had caused others to suffer, Abel among them. From that day on, Lananoa settled in the coastal city, dedicating herself to helping the people with her magic as a way to atone for her past. She ended her story by asking Abel to give her another chance, explaining that she had truly changed over the years. She wanted to prove that she was no longer the person she used to be. With a gentle smile, Lananoa produced a tray with 2 cups and offered one to Abel, asking him to trust her, as if she had never wronged him. Abel silently stared at the cups, finding it hard to believe in her sincerity. He looked at his reflection in the glass for a moment, then decided to give Lananoa another chance. Abel lifted the glass with the drink, and Lananoa followed suit, raising her glass and smiling as she suggested they toast to their reunion. Meanwhile, Layla lay her head on the table, exhausted. Abel took a sip of his drink, still unsure of what to truly believe. Layla was unconscious. Slowly, she began to regain her senses and opened her eyes. She found herself lying on the floor of a strange, cold room. For a long time, she couldn't see anything due to the darkness surrounding her. As her vision gradually adjusted, she started to look around, trying to remember what had happened. Her last memory was of enjoying herself at Mrs. Lananoa's party. She recalled that the girl had mentioned going to get some food, but after that, they hadn't seen each other again. Now, Layla was trying to figure out how she ended up on the floor in a locked room. Nothing seemed suspicious at the party. Everyone had been friendly. Over time, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she noticed a cage with huge, clawed harps poking out. She stepped back abruptly, frightened. There wasn't an animal in the cage, but a monster. Terrified, she stood up and looked around. Everywhere, there were cages, and from them came terrifying sounds. Someone was calling for help, someone else was growling. Apparently, there weren't just monsters in the cages. Layla looked around and saw a wide variety of creatures, all chained and caged. She couldn't understand how she had ended up in a room with them. Shocked, she tried to make sense of what was happening and what kind of place this was. She She couldn't fathom who would need to lock people up with monsters. Everyone around her was growling or screaming to be freed. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Turning around, she saw Mrs. Lananoa standing silently. She stared at Layla with a look that was completely different from the friendly demeanor she had shown in the city. Layla rushed over to Mrs. Lananoa to ask where they were and if they had been kidnapped. She assumed that Lananoa knew how to get out of the cage using magic and find her, but she was wrong. Lananoa remained silent. She just stood there without saying a word. Layla noticed the grim look on her face and tried calling out to her again. At some point, Lananoa stopped trying to engage with Layla and stepped back a few paces. Then, she smiled and burst into loud laughter, covering her face with her hand. She looked mockingly at Layla, who was still trying to understand the situation. The dwarf asked if Layla still didn't get it. Horrified, Layla stared back, realizing that the Lananoa she had known was just an act. The dwarf had been pretending all along, scheming to capture Abel and Layla. The dwarf slammed her staff into the ground, and near her, a seal emerged with Abel tied to it in the shape of a cross. Layla screamed when she saw him hanging upside down, unconscious. The dwarf recalled the special potion she had given Abel and said he hadn't woken up for 3 days. Judging by her words, Abel would remain unconscious for a long time. He didn't react at all. The dwarf smiled and said it was easy to control a man. She just pretended to be weak to gain their trust. That's how she had managed all her life, manipulating everyone. Layla remembered the townspeople who only spoke highly of their master and were willing to defend Lananoa. This struck her as strange, as the villagers seemed quite sincere. Layla couldn't believe that Lananoa had deceived everyone into supporting her. In truth, it was all a grand performance, staged with the downfall of Laura, Abel, and Layla in mind. Layla yelled, demanding to know what Lananoa meant by all this. She remembered how Lananoa had claimed she was getting better, and she had believed her because of the story Lananoa had told. Lananoa smirked and said that, in a way, she had improved. She spread her arms wide and announced that she would now treat Abel even worse than before, laughing even harder. She went on, saying that Abel had always been useless and she had never felt the need to repent. She hadn't cared about him until he was freed from the stone shell in which he was trapped. Layla was moved. She remembered the townspeople who spoke so tenderly of their beloved Lananoa. She recalled a boy who cried because he feared they would harm Lananoa. Layla raised her head and, looking at Lananoa, wondered if she had really made all the villagers play along with her scheme. She couldn't believe it. All this time, Abel had been right that Lananoa hadn't changed. Lananoa said that Layla had finally understood her tale of how she had subdued all the villagers with her magic. Now, everyone obeyed her unconditionally and followed her every order. It was easy with magic. The dwarf touched her face and said she needed a lot of vitality to maintain her beauty, which she valued greatly because it helped her achieve her goals. She explained that draining the life force from a single person was too difficult, so she decided to command the entire city to have immediate access to a large pool of vitality. She said men were the easiest to control with magic, especially when they were mesmerized by the beauty of a woman, and Lananoa herself was quite beautiful. Lananoa took off her cloak, revealing that this coastal city had always been her testing ground. She had been constantly experimenting with her magic on the residents and the monsters of this city. Over time, the city had become the perfect place for her to indulge in her hobby. Layla watched in horror as monsters began to appear behind Lananoa. Lananoa turned to her servants and announced it was time to have some fun. The monsters roared with joy. One of them lunged at Layla, growling furiously and raising its claws. Layla ran, shouting that it had all been Lananoa's doing. She remembered that Abel had been suspicious from the very beginning. Layla fell to the ground, screaming in pain. At that moment, a huge, monstrous hand stretched toward her, about to grab her. One of the monsters seized Layla and laughed. The girl screamed and tried to break free, but she couldn't. The monster held her tightly with its enormous claw. Lananoa didn't blush at all. She said she loved it when people screamed. The girl was strange and cruel, enjoying seeing others suffer. She even encouraged abuse. Layla turned and, gathering all her strength, directed a small flame at Lananoa. But the flame was too weak. It didn't reach her and quickly went out. Her magic was still very weak. The dwarf laughed at her and asked what she had tried to do. One of the monsters began shaking Layla in its arms, squeezing her tighter, causing her to groan in pain. She struggled to break free from the monster's grasp. The dwarf spoke of how she had seen, through her magic crystal ball, how Abel managed to free himself from his stone prison. She hadn't seen him in 20 years and never thought he would be able to do something like that. The dwarf smiled, expressing her joy that the boy had freed himself, adding that if the girl hadn't fought back, perhaps Abel wouldn't have believed in the staged performance. Layla looked at the dwarf in horror horror, gritting her teeth as she realized how foolish she had been. She should have listened to Abel, who had known Lananoa for a long time. Lananoa sighed, saying she was absolutely thrilled. As she released all her magical energy, she smiled and told her monster to enjoy its meal. Lananoa approached Layla, leaning towards her while she screamed in horror, savoring every second of her sacrifice. A magical smoke whirled directly into Layla's face. After that, Layla felt her powers leaving her. She thought of Abel and pleaded for help. She hadn't expected things to turn out this way, but now she felt powerless and needed Abel's assistance. Layla remembered how Abel had protected her throughout their journey. No matter what kind of monster Abel was, he always came to her rescue, never abandoning her to the monsters. She thought that she was only asking for Abel's help because she had seen his sad face. She decided to save him, thinking she could help in some way, if not with magic, then at least with support. Then, she resolutely declared that she didn't want to be a burden to Abel. She wanted to be the one to protect him. She wanted to be his equal. She would fight to continue the journey with him. Layla remembered Abel's advice about controlling her magic. She needed to stay calm. The most important thing was to harness the magic within her body. Layla closed her eyes and thought about what Abel had taught her. She had to protect herself, even if only to cook for him. Now was the time for her to stand on her own and help him. Layla raised her head and looked resolutely at Lananoa. She pulled her hand to the side and shouted as her hand began to glow. Layla looked at the dwarf, who seemed confused by her actions. Suddenly, Layla punched the dwarf squarely in the face. The dwarf had no time to react or dodge the blow. Furious, a large red mark appeared on her cheek. The dwarf was thrown back, hitting the ground hard. She couldn't get up and lay there until the monsters approached to help her stand. But at that moment, one of the monsters offered Layla a hand to grab, giving her a chance to escape. She managed to put some distance between herself and the monster, far enough to avoid being caught. The dwarf was livid, seeing the monsters still trying to help their master up. Meanwhile, Layla sat on the floor, trying to catch her breath after her attack and escape from the monster. Lananoa cursed at her, shouting all sorts of insults and glaring angrily at the girl who had struck her. She vowed not to forgive the blow, especially now. Struggling to stand, leaning on her staff, she wondered how Layla dared to hit her beautiful face. She declared that she wouldn't let her live now. Using her staff, the dwarf created a seal and sent a massive magic beam directly at Layla, commanding her to say her goodbyes. She was sure it was the end for the girl. Layla watched the massive beam of magic coming toward her, eyes wide with fear, unable to move. She thought this was truly the end. There was nowhere to run, and Abel wouldn't help her. Suddenly, she whispered a word and deciphered another spell. Abel broke free from his confinement and rushed toward Layla to save her. He managed to grab her just before the magical beam could hit. The dwarf stared at Abel and Layla, her mouth agape in shock. Abel praised Layla for buying him time. He had seen how she managed to resist the witch. During this time, he had freed himself and mastered a new spell. He wasn't going to let Layla burn at the stake. He just needed time to decipher the new spell and escape. Layla looked at Abel as he told her he had completed the decryption. Kneeling in front of her, he placed his hand on her shoulder and told her she had done a great job. Then, turning around and raising his hands, he told Layla to leave the rest to him. He was determined to win the battle against Lananoa. Lananoa stood before him, holding her staff with both hands. Abel shielded Layla with his back and declared it was time to end this. He swore, calling out Lananoa, that Layla could hardly recognize him. She was stunned, watching as Abel took down the monsters in his path. Raising his hands, Abel formed a seal. The dwarf screamed, demanding to know how Abel had regained his knowledge after not waking for 3 days. She had prepared a potent potion that was supposed to keep him in a deep sleep. Abel glanced seriously at her, recalling their encounter in the alley. When he decided to give her a chance, he had thought long and hard about what to do. He had considered the possibility that Lananoa had truly changed but still had his doubts. He drank the potion and fell unconscious. The dwarf had smiled, thinking her plan had worked, that he believed her and could now be chained. But when he fell unconscious, he found himself before a huge screen with inscriptions again. He knew then that the dwarf was deceiving him, so he devised a new plan of action. Abel approached the screen, considering a new spell. Abel had assumed that the formula would be quite complicated, but he didn't expect it to be this challenging. It would take him a long time to decipher it. He tells the dwarf that he knew she would try to deceive him, which is why he deliberately drank the magic poison she offered, to study it through his decoding abilities. The dwarf grins through clenched teeth, staring intently at Abel. She was furious and decided not to wait any longer to attack. Abel turned to Layla, calling her to stand behind him. She obeyed and moved as carefully as possible to avoid disturbing him. All of Lananoa's monsters fixed their eyes on Abel, ready to attack. Lananoa was livid. She promised that she wouldn't let Abel escape alive. No one had ever made her this angry. She shouted an order to the monsters to capture Abel. The monsters obeyed immediately, lunging forward with outstretched arms. Abel formed a seal and cast a spell on the monsters. They stopped in their tracks as they began to freeze. Their bodies were enveloped in a stone shell, petrifying over and over again. Abel declared that he didn't care if the monsters had once been human. He demanded that they not interfere with him. His goal was to defeat Lananoa and exact his revenge, and he wouldn't forgive anyone who stood in his way. The monsters were immobilized as the stone shell encased their bodies. They could only growl briefly before turning completely to stone. Yet more monsters kept coming. Meanwhile, a creature with large ears, sitting in a cage, watched Abel intently with its mouth agape. This creature, curious about the person who was overpowering the monsters, crawled closer to the bars for a better view. The monsters continued to attack Abel, but he continued to cast the petrification spell, turning them all to stone, freezing them forever. None of the monsters could withstand his powerful magic. Just then, Lananoa appeared behind Abel, intending to strike him from behind while he was distracted. She didn't care if the victory was fair or not. She just wanted to defeat him as quickly as possible. She recognized the power of his decoding ability, realizing that Abel could calmly dispel any magic and then use it himself. The dwarf thought that no matter how strong Abel was, he wouldn't be able to repel an attack. She charged her magic staff and aimed it at him, ready to strike. Abel had just formed a seal and didn't have time to turn around to counter the attack. Blood splattered. Abel's eyes widened. He didn't understand what had just happened, but felt a sharp pain in his back. At that moment, Layla covered her mouth in shock. She watched in horror as an arrow struck Abel's back. She wanted to help him, but she couldn't even move. The dwarf looked at Abel with a wicked grin, hugging her staff, and asked him what he had to say about her magic. She boasted that she used invisible magic, the invisible arrow. She explained that the arrow couldn't be seen until it hit its target. Abel hadn't seen or heard it coming. Abel fell to his knees from the pain, feeling as though an arrow had pierced his back. He hadn't had time to react or counter the attack. The dwarf declared he had lost. One of the monsters moved in to deliver the final blow. Lananoa said that Abel lost because he overestimated his strength. Layla shouted at Abel to do something, fearing he wouldn't have time to act and avoid the blow. Abel smiled and asked if Lananoa was truly sure he had lost. He waved his hand, lifting his cloak, revealing seals all around his body. Lananoa looked at him with anger. Layla gazed at Abel in admiration, surprised to see a magic circle under his cloak. Abel was protected all along. The dwarf's arrow hadn't harmed him. He was still alive and uninjured. He had prepared for such an eventuality, knowing what Lananoa was capable of. The dwarf stared at him in disbelief. She couldn't believe what was happening. She was certain she had defeated Abel with her powerful and unexpected attack, but she had miscalculated. Abel raised his hand and said that even though the dwarf was a terrible person, she was still a formidable sorceress, one of the heroes. Abel knew what she was capable of, so he prepared in advance. Lananoa, thinking this was all nonsense, decided to continue the battle and attempt another strike. She wondered if Abel had activated his decoding ability for his entire body. She scrutinized him, trying to devise a new strategy to win safely. Realizing she couldn't defeat someone with such an ability, she fell to her knees. She hadn't been prepared for such a strong opponent and hadn't expected Abel to have grown so powerful. Defeated, the dwarf knew she could only rely on magical attacks. Realizing her powerlessness again, she accepted her defeat. Kneeling before Abel, she clung to his leg and began to apologize, admitting she had been foolish and wrong. It was yet another manipulation. The dwarf offered Abel a deal. If he spared her life, she would do anything he wanted. She promised to be obedient and never manipulate anyone again. Blushing, she looked directly into his eyes with a piercing gaze, insisting she would do anything. Abel remained silent for a while before placing his hand on her shoulder. She called out to him again, seeking an answer, but Abel stayed silent for a long time, merely looking at her, and then he smiled. He told her to give up, assuring her it was over. Lananoa no longer needed to fight. She had lost and could do nothing against him. Abel used the petrification spell, and as a result, the girl's shoulder began to turn into stone armor. She felt a heaviness on her shoulder. The girl realized that only Abel could stop the spell now. He told her that no one would believe Lananoa anymore. He said she had rejected her last chance. Lananoa suddenly remembered the townspeople who had tried to help her unknowingly. Abel mentioned that, in truth, he was happy she had changed. The girl began to scream, begging Abel not to do it. She pleaded desperately, but Abel didn't listen. He continued, saying that ever since they started their journey 20 years ago, he had hated her. He leaned close to her face as he said this. The dwarf screamed loudly, pleading for him to stop. Her hands were already encased in a stone shell, and she kept screaming, terrified that her beauty was being destroyed. Then, a thought struck her. If she turned into stone, her beauty would be eternal. This was exactly what she had wanted all her life. Her dream was about to come true. She began laughing maniacally, and a moment later, she froze completely, becoming a stone statue. It was a chilling sight, her hand raised and her face frozen in that mad laughter. Abel looked at her, then turned away, saying she wasn't beautiful at all. He approached Layla and told her it was time for them to leave. He no longer wanted to stay in a place like this. Layla and Abel decided to continue their journey. By this time, many residents had regained consciousness, blinking rapidly as if waking from a long sleep. All the townspeople who had been turned into monsters had returned to their human forms. They emerged into the square, confused, unable to remember what had happened to them all this time. All of this was thanks to Abel. He stopped suddenly and apologized to Layla. She was startled and didn't understand why he was apologizing. She tried to figure out what had prompted him to apologize. Abel explained that in his plan, he hadn't considered her safety because revenge was his top priority. He admitted that revenge would continue to be a priority, but he also said that her safety was very important to him. He added that even when she worried about him, he remembered that Layla had tried to protect him. Her eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected to hear something like that from him. Abel rarely spoke like this, so she was very grateful for his words. She truly wanted to help him and couldn't leave him alone. Abel sighed and said he had made a decision for himself. Suddenly, Layla heard a noise. She and Abel turned to look at the bushes from where the sound came. They waited for a while, trying to discern what was making the noise. Suddenly, someone jumped out of the bushes, shouting that they had found him. It was a strange girl with ears who leapt up, raised her hands, and ran toward Abel, calling him the Demon King, saying she had witnessed his battle. She dropped to her knees and bowed to Abel. She grabbed Abel's right hand, saying she wanted to obey him and follow all his orders. She wanted to accompany the future Demon King. Abel looked at Layla in astonishment, not understanding how the creature could mistake him for the Demon King. He wondered what this girl was talking about. The girl continued, insisting that Abel would become the Demon King. She pressed her head against him, rubbing it against his leg. Abel tried to make sense of what she was saying. He couldn't believe he would ever become a Demon King, as she claimed. He just wanted revenge against his tormentors. Layla thought the girl, named Galgo, had appeared very unexpectedly. It seemed to her that Galgo admired Abel greatly, and Layla blushed at the thought. She didn't like thinking about it. Abel tried to stop Galgo. She raised her head and listened attentively. He asked why Galgo thought he was the Demon King and why she needed his right hand. Layla watched Galgo skeptically, waiting for her answer, as she also didn't fully understand why this girl had gotten involved in their journey. They hadn't planned on gathering a whole team of diverse members. Galgo dropped to her knees again. Layla thought she liked to pose because this wasn't her first time doing it. As they continued down the path, the group was mostly silent, exhausted from the battle. Galgo smiled and introduced herself, saying she was once part of the Demon King's army. She repeated her name, Galgo, and said she was looking for a master to serve. Abel asked about the Demon King's army. Galgo rubbed her neck, explaining that she had been dismissed long ago and no longer served the current Demon King. She had no purpose anymore, so she wanted to travel with them. She mentioned she had always dreamed of joining the Demon King's army, but they kicked her out when they discovered she was half-human. Only demons and monsters were allowed there. After being expelled, she traveled across the country until a witch captured her. She hadn't expected the witch to catch her, but Galgo couldn't resist the witch's many monsters. She had been in a cage for a long time, almost losing hope, when she saw Abel using the petrification spell that the Demon King used. At first, Galgo watched Abel, trying to figure out if he was truly the Demon King. She widened her eyes when she saw his immense magical power. It was very strong. Galgo blinked and exclaimed when she remembered how she saw Abel, immediately realizing he was the next Demon King. She was convinced that Abel would become famous by defeating the current Demon King and taking his place. Layla approached Abel, leaning in to whisper her thoughts. When Galgo saw him defeat a member of the heroes group, she thought he was a villain. Layla cleared her throat and told Galgo that she had misunderstood everything. The girl says that Abel isn't going to become the Demon King and isn't recruiting people for his group. Galgo starts to get angry and yells that she's talking nonsense. He addresses Layla as a maid and tells her she has no right to speak in front of the master. Layla yells back, asking why she's been mistaken for a maid. Galgo points a finger at her and asks if she really believes the beast men didn't see how she took blows from the witch and couldn't stand up to the monsters. She says Layla was useless to Abel. Then Galgo steps closer and asks if there's a chance that Layla doesn't want anyone else joining their journey. Layla, feeling embarrassed, asks Galgo to stop saying such things. Galgo was about to barrage Layla with more questions when Layla turned around and asked Abel if he had anything to say. She asked him if he was seriously considering taking Galgo on their journey. Abel looked away and remained silent, staring at the ground, realizing his answer might not be what she wanted to hear. Galgo smirked. Layla approached Abel, grabbing his cloak, and began to ask if he had understood her correctly. She wondered what expression he had on his face. Layla realized Abel probably didn't mind taking Galgo with them. At that moment, Abel said nothing, remembering that he had always liked animals with fur. He looked at Galgo's ears and tail, which resembled those of a monkey, and felt embarrassed by his thoughts. Galgo's fluffy ears and tail made it hard for him to say no. He decided that a little extra help wouldn't be a bad thing, especially since they had a long journey ahead. Suddenly, Galgo seemed to sense something. He opened his eyes wide and quickly moved away from Abel to the opposite side, as if foreseeing something and avoiding it. Abel didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, something landed behind him with a massive impact, something huge and inhuman. A gigantic dust cloud rose, obscuring their view. Abel, Galgo, and Layla turned around, stunned by the sudden incident. To be continued, everyone was trying to figure out what had just happened. The dust was still hanging in the air, making it difficult to see. A huge iron worm with glowing yellow eyes emerged before them. The entire group was in shock. They had never seen anything like it. The creature looked terrifying as it examined its opponents. Layla shouted that the heat seemed intense. She screamed, asking what kind of creature it was. She was terrified, unable to imagine how they could face such a monster. Galgo, however, seemed impressed by the creature and shouted that it was an iron worm, known for frequently interfering with the witch. Galgo said they needed to deal with the worm as soon as possible. Abel looked at the surprised Galgo and wondered if she had noticed the worm before. After all, she had moved away from the spot where the worm had landed. At that moment, the girl stood there, her mouth open in shock. Abel quickly formed a seal with his hands and aimed at the worm, deciding he didn't have time to think. The most important thing now was the fight. He realized the worm could cause significant problems, so he decided to use the spell. Suddenly, the iron worm began to attack fiercely, towering over Abel and the others. Abel watched the worm closely, waiting for its attack. The iron worm swung the lower part of its body with tremendous force, trying to strike a wall just as Abel and the others stood still. Layla didn't have time to react as the worm almost crushed her. Abel grabbed her in his arms and ran. Galgo immediately dropped to all fours and ran after them. Layla turned her head and asked how the iron worm could repel Abel's attack, given how strong his attacks usually were. His decoding ability typically allowed him to defeat any enemy. Galgo explained that the iron worm was protected by a shell as strong as steel, making it difficult to damage. Such armor would need to be pierced with something more serious and heavy. The iron worm caught up to them and planted itself right in front of them. Abel, Galgo, and Layla realized they needed a new plan to escape if they wanted to survive. Abel looked at the iron worm and decided to use the petrification spell. He began to form a seal and prepared to cast the spell. Just as he was about to use it, Galgo interrupted him. Abel stopped and widened his eyes, watching as Galgo leapt forward, jumped, and flew directly toward the iron worm to attack it. Galgo swung and struck the worm with his hand. After the impact, the worm's iron armor cracked and shattered into pieces. The iron worm fell to the side, no longer able to attack. Layla was stunned, unable to believe what was happening. Galgo had managed to defeat a giant worm with a single blow. They hadn't expected Galgo to be so strong. Galgo grinned and, smiling broadly, wondered what the Demon King would think. She was thrilled to participate in a battle after being confined in the witch's cage for so long. Galgo stood triumphantly atop the defeated iron creature and declared that this was her true strength. She said she would be valuable on their journey, able to attack on the front lines and defend from the rear. Abel smiled faintly at Galgo, thinking about her impressive physical strength. He decided that her abilities could be useful in battle. Abel announced that Galgo would join them on their journey after all. Galgo cheered with joy, while Layla asked Abel what he meant by that. Abel continued, saying that if Layla had the desire, she could become stronger too. Late in the afternoon, Abel, Layla, and Galgo passed through a cave. Layla pulled out a bag of gold and began counting the coins. She thought there was very little money and, now that there were 3 of them, the travel expenses would be even higher. Layla sighed, thinking that they would need to find a way to get more money. They would likely need to save up, or perhaps they could collect coins from the monster monsters they defeated. Galgo sensed something, raised her head, twitched her ears, and looked at Abel. Layla noticed and turned to him, calling his name. Galgo felt they were not alone on the road. The whole group stopped abruptly. It seemed Abel had also realized someone was following them. Abel called out to the pursuers, asking who they were. He said he knew someone was following them and demanded they show themselves. Suddenly, a voice came from behind one of the caves, saying they had suspected their presence had been detected. Abel turned around and saw their pursuers approaching. A pink-haired girl in armor appeared, followed by several knights wearing identical armor. The girl placed her hand on her chest and pleaded for them to save her country. Abel looked at the group of knights, confused as to where these armored men had come from and what kind of protection they were asking for. But the girl seemed very determined, showing no intention of backing down. As dusk fell, a man in armor sat in one of the fortress's rooms. He was tense. His name was Aiden, and he had once been part of a group of heroes. Now, 20 years later, he had become a knight. The man was sweating profusely, sitting alone in the room, seemingly waiting for someone, which explained his anxiety. Abel, Galgo, and Layla got into a carriage with the armored men. They rode in complete silence, feeling uncomfortable. Galgo said she didn't like Layla's carriages, prompting Layla to tell her to be quiet and listen to their new acquaintances. The pink-haired girl in armor pressed her hand to her chest again, introducing herself by name and age. She said she was the captain of the Knights of the Claymore Kingdom. She mentioned they were currently traveling to Claymore Kingdom, her homeland. She explained that her kingdom was still actively fighting the Demon King and that she had come in search of allies, but the neighboring kingdom had rejected her. On the way back home, they needed more warriors. They had witnessed the battle between Abel, Galgo, and Layla against the Iron Worm. It was Layla who had persuaded everyone to go with them. She expressed her heartfelt gratitude to Layla, Abel, and Galgo, saying that if they helped, their war with the Demon King might finally end. Nade bowed deeply, saying there weren't enough words to express her gratitude. Abel thought the girl was exaggerating and was too excited. He wondered how she hadn't yet been hit with a shield for being so enthusiastic. At that moment, Galgo started looking out the window, admiring the view. The knights tried to pull her back into the carriage, warning she could fall and asking her not to lean out so much. Abel tapped his knee with his finger, thinking it might be better if he went in search of the next group of heroes. He recalled how happy Layla was when Nade mentioned a reward, which convinced him to take a short break from their main quest. He couldn't say no when he saw the delight in her eyes. Abel believed Layla didn't want to hear a negative response and was already mentally spending the reward she hoped to receive. At that time, Layla asked if they could help Nade in her kingdom. Abel thought about their need for money and agreed. He also remembered that Nade had information about Stark and other members of the group of heroes. Abel knew Gordon didn't know everything, and they understood they had a long journey ahead. They needed to prepare, stock up on money, equipment, and food. 5 days later, the carriage carrying Nade, Galgo, Abel, and Layla arrived at the fortress. The entire group gaped at the towering structures of Claymore Castle, and even Galgo was amazed by the kingdom's vast size. Galgo said she had never seen such a large gate, and Layla agreed, noting how grand it felt at first sight. Layla, having lived in a small town, had never seen anything like it. Nade went ahead, saying she would introduce them to her master and inform them when he was ready. She told Abel, Layla, and Galgo they could take a walk and look around in the meantime. Galgo started turning her head from side to side. Layla noticed this and decided to ask what was happening, sensing that Galgo was acting strangely since they entered the fortress. A man approached and greeted Nade. She greeted him, calling him Master. They began exchanging news and discussing the results of their journey. Abel was stunned when he saw the Master. The Master seemed equally shocked, wondering how Abel could have escaped his stone captivity. He vividly remembered how the man had been frozen like a statue. Abel recognized him as one of the heroes. This was confirmed by the Master's surprised reaction. Abel turned to the man, asking if they truly knew each other and why they both had such a reaction. Suddenly, Abel lunged directly at the Master, intending to attack him. The man screamed in fear, and Nade quickly stepped in front of him, blocking Abel's blow with a shield. Abel didn't have time to use his spell. Although he had already formed the seal, Nade anxiously looked at him, asking what was wrong. She didn't understand why Abel had suddenly attacked her master. Abel glanced at the shield blocking his strike and pondered how Nade could have countered his magic. At that moment, Nade asked her master if he was okay. Layla covered her mouth in shock, not wanting to fight again. Galgo, however, was delighted, clenching her fists and shouting her excitement about continuing to attack the man. Abel grew angry, demanding Nade move aside and not interfere with him. He explained that the master was one of Aiden's group of heroes and that he was traveling to take revenge on those who had wronged him. Nade reaches out her hand and asks what Abel means. She asks why he would want revenge on her teacher and urges him to calm down. She tries to resolve the conflict to prevent any casualties, explaining that the master is an indispensable person for their kingdom. Nade says the master is the leader of all the knights in their realm and plays a very important role. The man tries to say something, but Nade continues, stating that he is the main military power of the Claymore Kingdom, leading all the troops and knights who protect the realm. Nade takes a fighting stance, firmly declaring that as long as she is alive, she won't let anyone harm her master, not even a finger. She is determined to protect him because he is important not only to her but also to the entire country. Abel looks at the man, who turns his gaze away as if nothing had happened. Abel begins to feel intense anger, not accepting how Aiden behaves as if he were mocking him, just like the rest of the heroes. Nade then invites Abel, Layla, and Galgo to stay the night at the fortress. She suggests speaking with her master and advises him to reconsider asking Abel for help. She also asks Abel not to fight with her teacher. Abel chuckles and agrees to listen to her. Layla calls out to Abel, pointing out that he is bleeding, and asks if he is alright. She hadn't expected Abel to get hurt. Abel remembers being hit in the forehead with a shield. He watched as Nade and her teacher walked away, realizing that Nade was quite dangerous. She was able to repel his attack and protect her teacher, so he didn't doubt her strength. Nade stood in the fortress hallway, right in front of her teacher. She wanted to speak to him after their long journey. They needed to discuss the outcomes and decide on their next steps. Nade apologized to the teacher for the failed negotiations with Alcoa. The man laughed, saying they always argued with Alcoa, so it was to be expected. He didn't scold her. The teacher mentioned he hadn't expected her to bring Abel, wondering how his student had personally brought a former ally of Aiden. It had been 20 years since he last saw him, and he admitted he was very scared. The man smiled, saying that if it weren't for Nade, Abel might have hurt him. He laughed nervously, trying to act as if everything was fine. Abel, Layla, and Galgo were escorted inside the castle to one of the rooms. They immediately sat down at a table filled with a vast amount of delicious food and began to eat. They were starving after their long journey. Abel was in a grim mood. He covered his face, frustrated that Nade had prevented him from taking revenge on his tormentors. He felt he needed to do something, as he had been feeling this way for a long time. He had already dealt with his first two attackers. Meanwhile, Galgo was eating her food rapidly. Layla told Abel that he should calm down first. To Layla, the teacher seemed too weak to be a member of the group of heroes. She couldn't believe he was now leading the fortress troops. She also noticed how much the man feared Abel. Abel lifted his shirt, revealing the scar left by the poker. He remembered how the heroes had treated him throughout their journey together. Abel wasn't surprised that Layla found the teacher weak, as among all the heroes, he was the most cowardly. He wasn't violent, but he was easily swayed by the stronger heroes. Abel recalled his own hands being tied and his mouth gagged. At that moment, a young Aiden was looking at him angrily. Aiden was as worried as the others because he had to comply with Stark's orders. Stark, sitting to the side and smiling, asked what Aiden was waiting for, saying it was simple. He instructed Aiden to persuade Abel with a poker while tied to the ground. Aiden's body trembled with fear as Stark assured him that if he failed, Stark would take his place. Aiden was terrified. He couldn't disobey Stark, fearing above all that he might be replaced. Aiden swung the poker, shouting abruptly, and hit Abel with the cord, who endured the pain. He couldn't resist or do anything about his wound, so he simply lay on the ground and endured it. Aiden had always been a pathetic subordinate to Stark, doing everything the strongest hero in the group told him to do. He lacked character and was afraid to defend his position, so he followed the others. This conversation was overheard by an elderly woman standing near the slightly open door. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her teacher wasn't like that at all, or at least she had never seen this side of him. Abel continued his story, saying that Aiden was willing to do anything to protect his own life. Despite fulfilling Stark's demands, Abel spoke negatively of him. At that moment, Abel said he believed Aiden also deserved revenge. Suddenly, Nade burst into the room, flinging the door open, and shouted that what Abel was saying wasn't true. Everyone immediately turned to look at her. Layla called out her name, surprised that someone had been eavesdropping on the other side of the door. Nade insisted that Aiden was named Chief of the Knights because he was a member of the group of heroes. He had become Chief of the Knights through his connections, but Nade believed in him for another reason. She decided to tell a story that she believed would show Aiden was a good person and deserved to be Chief of the Knights. She explained that her teacher was the one who had saved her. She recalled her childhood, living on the streets in old clothes and rags, nearly dying from the cold. She says she doesn't care which group her teacher was in. She believes he is worthy because she she trusts him. Even though she has known him for only a year, she knows her teacher very well. Layla looks at the girl with disbelief, and Galgo also watches with curiosity, still chewing her food. Everyone turned to the girl, expecting at least some reaction after her story. Abel was trying to figure out what had happened to the girl to make her believe that Aiden had saved her. He thought the entire story of Aiden saving Nade was nonsense. He believed that if it were true, then someone must have forced Aiden to do it. Aiden always followed the will of others, so it was hard for Abel to believe in such a heroic act. Galgo took Layla's hand, and Layla noticed, turning to her. Galgo wiped the crumbs from her mouth and asked if they were really talking about that armored man who met them at the door. She pointed to her nose and said he had a very strange smell. Layla looked at Galgo, trying to understand what she meant. Layla hadn't noticed anything unusual, likely because she wasn't a half-beast like Galgo. Aiden was standing in one of the rooms late at night, leaning against the wall, wondering why Abel was still alive. He remembered how Abel had jumped forward to take a blow from Stark, which resulted in him being frozen in stone for life. The man was very anxious, repeating to himself that it was too late. He had already done something terrible, and it was too late to think about the consequences now that Abel had returned after 20 years. Nearby, on a hill within the fortress, a creature with wings and a long tail sat, its yellow eyes glinting as it laughed. It wasn't in a good mood after the conversation with Abel. The creature knocked on a door before leaving for its room. Meanwhile, Nade was still convinced her teacher was a good person. Abel clenched his fist, thinking Aiden couldn't be as kind as Nade claimed. He had long since stopped considering the possibility that Aiden had genuinely changed. But then, Abel grudgingly admitted to himself that Aiden could have changed after all. His jaw tightened with tension. If Aiden really had changed, then Abel might not be able to take revenge on him. This thought darkened Abel's mood even more. Layla kept watching Abel with concern. She wanted to calm him down and reassure him, disliking how the situation was escalating. Suddenly, Layla started speaking. She said she was very pleased, hoping to get a reaction from Abel. She thought at least she had caught his attention. Abel looked up at her, puzzled. He didn't understand what she meant and waited for her to continue. There would be much to think about after dinner. Layla remembered that during their journey, Abel had started talking about himself for the first time when he mentioned the group of heroes. That was when she learned something new about him, which made her feel very satisfied. Abel's eyes widened as everyone fell silent. Then Layla blushed and smiled, thinking that at least she had managed to distract Abel from thoughts about the former member of the heroes, Aiden. Abel was confused, trying to remember when he had talked about the group of heroes or about himself. He couldn't recall anything and didn't like dwelling on past times. The room was very quiet since no one started talking again. Abel remained in a stupor, a slight smile on his face, and it stayed that way for a while. Galgo shook her head from side to side, feeling bored and not understanding why everyone had suddenly stopped talking. What concerned her most at that moment was the food on the table, not the conversations. Suddenly, Layla got up from her chair, saying she needed to go to the bathroom, and quickly left the room. She decided she needed a break. Galgo lay down on a bed and told Abel they should go to sleep. Abel was still tense but agreed with her. At that moment, it started raining outside. Layla stood next to a wall, blushing, realizing she had run out of the room under the pretext of needing the bathroom. She wasn't sure why she had done it. She held her head in her hands and, smiling, thought the conversation had been very uncomfortable. It was awkward for her to recall the discussion about the group of heroes, but she had done it to distract Abel somehow. She was tired of the strange atmosphere and decided to stop thinking about it and go back. She assumed Abel and Galgo were already waiting for her to go to bed. Layla walked down the long corridor back to the room. She couldn't find it for a while, but then remembered the way and approached the correct corner leading to their room. As she turned the corner, she saw Aiden heading somewhere. She quickly stepped back, hiding behind the corner, and decided to follow him. Aiden seemed very tense. He lowered his head, muttering that he had done everything as agreed and that everything was ready. He seemed to be following someone's orders again. Layla tried to figure out who Aiden was talking to. She peeked around the corner but saw no one. Looking closer, she realized Aiden was no longer there either. Just a moment ago, he had been in the middle of the long corridor. She turned the corner, trying to figure out where he had gone and who he had been speaking to. She couldn't believe a man could disappear so abruptly, especially since she had seen him just seconds earlier. At that moment, a bat-like creature appeared behind her, hanging from the ceiling and laughing. The creature was watching its prey, waiting for Layla to notice it. Layla heard the laughter and looked around in fear. Just then, lightning struck outside. The creature declared it was time to start the fight, clearly excited. Suddenly, the doors of the fortress were breached by a massive dragon-shaped battering ram. A loud thud echoed throughout the fortress. The locks flew off and the the doors collapsed. The wooden parts of the door shattered, flying in all directions. Galgo turned at the sound, as did Layla and the other knights, startled by the noise, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Although they were inside the fortress, they heard clearly the commotion outside. One of the knights in the fortress tower began ringing the bell and shouting that they were under attack by the Demon King's army. Monsters were pouring into the fortress, screaming and growling. They had launched a surprise night attack, being ruthless creatures loyal only to the Demon King, with no regard for honesty or justice. Abel ran to the teacher, urging him to give the order. Though he seemed unsure, the teacher decided to act. He shouted for all troops to head to the main gate. Abel removed his coat, realizing that Layla hadn't returned. He asked Basturi to go search for the brave girl, instructing him to try and track her scent or find any clues to her location. Galgo asked if Abel would join the battle, but Abel replied that he wouldn't. Finding Layla was his priority. He wouldn't leave her alone in danger. He had decided that her safety would also be a priority. Abel stated that if anyone got in his way, he would deal with them immediately and show no mercy. Galgo, excited by the prospect of many more fights and battles, grinned. Monsters attacked the fortress, flying around and spewing fire or attempting to strike with weapons. The fortress guards tried to fend them off with bows and swords, but their efforts were largely ineffective. Meanwhile, Abel and Galgo raced up one of the towers, while everyone else was busy defending against the Demon King's army. Abel and Galgo had a different mission altogether. They were not there to aid the knights. Abel noticed that the Demon King's army had a clear advantage. Suddenly, he sensed danger approaching as monsters headed their way. A huge creature resembling a stork leaped and landed right in front of them. It stared them down, groaning, a massive beast, intimidating. Abel quickly formed a seal and was about to cast his spell, a magical ray, directly at the creature. Galgo ducked to avoid the ray, which struck the monster, blocking their path head-on. The magical ray hit the creature, and it began to encase itself in a stone shell. Stunned, it couldn't move and wanted to attack Abel again, but the petrification took hold, and the monster froze solid. Another monster, resembling a giant bird, flew towards them next, screeching loudly and flapping its wings, kicking up dust and dirt. Galgo sprang forward to confront it. She jumped, swung her arm, and struck the creature with her claws, delivering a powerful blow. The monster was defeated in a single strike. Abel and Galgo continued their advance. Abel asked where they should head next, and Galgo pointed forward. They leapt from the tower, landing where Nade and her knights were battling the monsters. Nade was defending herself with her sword and shield, shouting that there were too many monsters. She was certain that if things continued like this, they would lose. The knights were outnumbered and weaker than the monsters. At that moment, Abel and Galgo landed on the ground, charging through the swarm of monsters, eliminating all those in their path. Monsters flew in every direction, turning to stone upon contact. Abel smiled and praised Galgo, who blushed and grinned, saying she didn't need praise and that she was still far from becoming the Demon King. The knights and Nade watched in awe, marveling at the strength and speed of Abel and Galgo. High above, a winged creature watched everything unfold. It seemed the rumors were true, and it smiled. Abel and Galgo stood back to back, having defeated almost all the monsters. The creatures lay unconscious at their feet. Together, they had taken down nearly every monster. The Legion of Saints thanked Abel and Galgo for their help in defending the fortress. Nade said that without their aid, they wouldn't have been able to hold their ground. She surveyed the fortress and the fallen monsters. Abel turned to her and clarified that they hadn't defeated the monsters to save the fortress's inhabitants. They had only done it because the monsters were preventing them from finding Layla. Abel added that he wasn't there to save the people of the fortress. Galgo suddenly felt something. Her ears perked up and her eyes widened. She turned to Abel and told him that the monster attack wasn't over yet. She sensed another wave approaching. Everyone rushed back to the broken door. A new, massive horde of monsters was advancing directly toward the fortress. The knights, though already exhausted, braced themselves for another long battle. Suddenly, the monsters began their attack again, and the knights tried to fend them off. This time, there were even more monsters than before. They attacked the knights fiercely, attempting to break into the castle. Abel questioned how the monsters had managed to enter the castle. Nade was struggling to repel the attacks and remarked that it was simply impossible for the monsters to have opened all the doors by themselves. She noted that if another enemy breached the main gate, they would be caught between two fronts, making it even harder to defend themselves. She counterattacked another monster, but still couldn't determine how the monsters had entered the castle. She suspects there is a traitor among them, but she doesn't know who it could be, as none of the knights appear suspicious. The man in the raincoat opens another door. Galgo senses something and points to Aiden, stating that he is the traitor because he smells of demons. At first, first, Nade doesn't understand. Aiden turns around and sees Abel glaring at him with a dark expression. Abel starts to get angry and says he knew it all along, calling Aiden a traitor. Aiden is terrified because he realizes he has been found out and now has to answer for his actions. Nade steps right in front of Aiden, blocking Abel's path. She insists that there must be some mistake and tries to find evidence to prove Aiden's innocence. She begins to defend him. Abel asks her to be quiet and questions whether she truly doesn't realize what's happening. He asks how long she plans to protect Aiden, pointing out that everything is now clear. Nade stands her ground, saying that because the teacher saved her, he couldn't possibly be guilty. Suddenly, a creature strikes Aiden in the back with a crystal. Aiden cries out in pain as the crystal starts to take effect. The creature taunts Aiden, saying that he will have to confront evil, even with such a small task, and reveals that he knew Aiden couldn't be trusted because he is a coward. Aiden starts to scream as his body begins to transform. He looks at his hands, watching them change before his eyes. He is horrified to realize he is becoming a monster. There is nothing he can do to stop the transformation. Nade and Abel look on in shock at what is happening. The creature laughs, saying that Aiden deserves his fate, watching with amusement as Aiden continues to change. A creature appears before Layla, holding something in her hands. She greets everyone, announcing that she is an officer in the Demon King's army and introduces herself as Hami. Abel shouts Layla's name, looking at her with concern. Hami takes flight, smiling, and declares it is time for the second round to begin. The girl flies away, leaving Abel and Nade to deal with the now monstrous Aiden. Dalgo is about to attack Jamie, who is still floating in the air. Sensing an opportunity, Jamie decides it's the perfect moment to return Layla, who is still held captive. However, she has no time to react and misses the monster's massive hand as it swings toward her. The blow lands hard, sending her crashing to the ground, clearly in pain. She loses consciousness, lying helpless on the ground. Suddenly, a massive green monster, resembling a dragon, appears, roaring loudly as it gazes menacingly at the knights. Aiden, losing control, charges at all the knights of the fortress. Necessita realizes, with horror, that her teacher has turned into a monster. She looks on in disbelief. She cannot comprehend how this could have happened. She had always believed in her master, trusting he would help them defeat the monsters. Jamie walks away, instructing Abel to continue playing his role in this twisted drama of revenge. She laughs, clearly enjoying the chaos, and it becomes obvious that she knows a lot more about Abel than she lets on. The knights are terrified of Aiden, while Abel tries to figure out how John B. knows about his revenge plans. He quickly dismisses these thoughts, realizing now is not the time for such considerations. His focus must be on Aiden and his monstrous transformation. Abel prepares a sealing spell, casting a petrifying curse on Aiden. However, the monster resists the spell, roaring in defiance. To Abel's shock, the creature is able to block his most powerful magic. Aiden swings his arm, smashing the ground and sending debris flying toward Abel. Abel tries to dodge the stones, but a few hit him. He curses, having underestimated Aiden's strength in this monstrous form. He realizes he needs a new strategy. As the monster launches another attack, Abel focuses on dodging, knowing that biding his time is the best approach until he finds the right moment to strike. Abel glances back and sees Galwin motionless on the ground, still not recovered from Aiden's blow. She lies there, completely out of the fight. He then spots Nade, sitting on the ground, looking utterly defeated. She seems lost, unsure of what to do now that her beloved teacher has become a monster. The betrayal of her teacher turning into a monster weighs heavily on Nade. She struggles to accept that Aiden, who once taught her so much, is now conspiring with a creature from the Demon King's army. The monster's gaze falls on her, and as she realizes this, her eyes widen in shock. She's torn, not wanting to fight her teacher, but Abel screams at her, telling her she must fight. He tries to convince her that Aiden is no longer human, and that she must fight for her survival no matter what. Abel readies himself, urging Nade to remember her duty as a knight. Aiden grabs Abel with one massive hand, trapping him. Abel groans in pain. Nade, remembering a conversation with Aiden when she was younger, recalls him asking her if she knew what it truly meant to be a knight. She hadn't known then, but Aiden's words echo in her mind now. With renewed determination, Nade leaps into action, striking Aiden's arm. The monster roars in pain and releases Abel. Abel quickly lands, unharmed. Standing beside him, Nade tells him that she's not doing doing this to help him and that she doesn't care about him. But as a knight, she says, it's her duty to protect others, just as Aiden had taught her. She's resolved to save her master no matter what. Abel smiles, asking Nade to buy him some time. She raises her sword, prepared to distract the monster so Abel can strike. The monster attacks, but Nade blocks the blow with her shield. Looking out from behind it, she declares that she won't lose. She knows how stubborn her teacher is, and she's determined to save him. The monster, struggling to regain control over its body, growls. Aiden, still inside, recalls the girl he once saved from the Demon King's army, the same girl who had lost her parents. He had promised her that he would become a worthy knight. That girl had followed him, listened to his every word, and found meaning in life thanks to him. But Aiden had never been a true knight. He was always improvising, lying his way through, doing whatever it took to survive. He didn't care about anyone. Yet now, looking at the girl, he felt proud of how strong she had become, despite all the lies he had fed her. Meanwhile, Abel takes advantage of the time Nade bought him. He prepares a new spell, bending the seal and preparing to defeat the monster Aiden has become. Abel lowers his hand, unleashing a lightning bolt straight at Aiden's monstrous form. He knows he must finish this fight and rescue Layla before it's too late. The lightning strike holds steady, and Aiden, in his monstrous form, grunts and thrashes, but something is preventing him from moving. Abel reveals that the battle is over. Chains materialize around Aiden's massive body, immobilizing him and draining all of his magical energy. The monster, once unstoppable, is now powerless to fight back. Aiden was restored to his human form when the monster's shell completely went dormant. Exhausted, he collapsed to his knees, no longer able to stand. As dawn broke, Ab stepped away from the scene. He clenched the monster's hand, reflecting that Aiden had become a monster due to the crystal that Jamie had driven into him. Closing his eyes, Abel used his powers, realizing he could now cast the enchantment since the monster had calmed down. With the shell falling away, Aiden collapsed to the ground, weak and frail. Necessita rushed to him, overjoyed that he had returned to his human form. But Aiden still felt terrible, both physically and emotionally. Clearing his throat, he made his way toward Abel, apologizing for everything he had done. During his journey with the heroes, he had come to realize how poorly he had treated Abel, all because of his own cowardice. Abel, surprised, sighed and decided to listen, even though it was painful to remember everything that had happened during their journey. Aiden admitted that he had done all those terrible things because of his weakness. He explained that he had always cowered before the strong and didn't know how to face them because of his fear. Even after finding his place, he betrayed everyone he loved to save his own life. Despite trying to be a beacon of light for a young girl, he had not changed. He recalled how ashamed he felt when he saw an old man fighting while he himself remained weak. The girl he raised had grown strong, physically and spiritually. She listened attentively, surprised by her teacher's words. Aiden didn't seek forgiveness. He simply felt he had to confess. He apologized again, burdened by guilt for everything that had happened at the fortress. Abel, shocked, found it strange that he actually believed Aiden's words. The sincerity was unmistakable, yet he couldn't bring himself to forgive the man after everything that had transpired. The voice inside him screamed that he could never forgive Aiden, not after suffering in stone for 20 years. He had lived for revenge, and now it was all he had. At that moment, a magical ray struck Abel in the chest. Everyone was stunned. Abel and Necessita couldn't understand what had happened, but quickly deduced who was responsible. Abel spotted Jamie sitting in one of the towers, grumbling about being bored. She had wanted to see more fighting and suffering, not apologies and tears. Seizing the moment, Abel lunged and grabbed Layla from Jamie's hands. Holding her close, he was relieved to see she was unharmed. Jamie, amused, asked Abel if he sought revenge for everything that had happened. She had been watching him for a while and noticed that he had grown soft. Before leaving, Jamie taunted Abel, assuring him that the black flame of his hatred should burn everything and that he shouldn't prioritize the safety of ordinary people. She laughed and revealed that the person she hated most would be waiting for Abel in the Demon King's castle, promising him an unpleasant surprise in the form of an old friend from the hero team. Then she flew off, leaving nothing more to do at the fortress. As the knights, alongside Abel, fought off the monster attack and Aiden returned to his human form, he was on the brink of death. Abel tried to stop Jamie but failed. Turning his focus to Aiden, Abel saw him living his final moments. Necessita called out to her teacher, begging him not to leave her. Aiden, trembling, held her hand, telling her that it wasn't he who had become worthy of her, but she who had taught him to be brave. With those final words, Aiden passed away. Necessita broke down, devastated by the loss of her mentor. Despite his lies and betrayal, Aiden had been her savior, and losing him was as painful as losing a loved one. Abel, seeing her grief, felt no better better than she did. Outside the fortress, it was a sunny day, though the fortress itself still bore scars from the monster attack. Inside, it was quiet as everyone gathered outside. One of the knights presented Abel and Galgo with a small bag of coins as a token of gratitude, even though they had little to offer. Abel, Galgo, and Layla stood on a stone bridge as the knights thanked them for their help. Abel, uninterested in rewards, was eager to leave and resume his search for the next member of the hero team. But suddenly, someone called out for Abel to stop. It was a young knight running through the fortress to catch up with Abel, Galgo, and Layla. Out of breath and blushing, the knight asked to join Abel's team. Abel and Layla were stunned, unable to understand why she wanted to join them after everything that had happened. Nade looked Abel in the eye and explained that the battle against the monsters in Aden had taught her something important. To protect everyone, they needed to defeat the Demon King as soon as possible. Abel immediately goes on the defensive and refuses. He states that his only interest is taking revenge on those who wronged him, suggesting that the girl should find someone else for her mission. He's convinced that he's not suitable for this role. Nade, however, remains silent for a while, contemplating how to convince Abel to join her. She firmly believes they need to cooperate to defeat the Demon King. Nade explains that in this world, Abel is the only one capable of standing up to the Demon King because of his unique decoding ability, which can nullify any spell. Moreover, Abel has already encountered the Demon King before. Nade places her hand on her chest, vowing to convince him to help defeat the Demon King, as she believes it is her duty as a knight. Abel is taken aback by her determination, frowning as he struggles to understand why he should be involved. He has his own goals, and defeating the Demon King is not one of them. At that moment, Layla approaches Abel, crouching next to him and whispering that it would be wise to bring Nade into their group. Layla points out that Nade's physical strength would complement Abel's abilities perfectly, covering his weaknesses in battle. Abel steps back from Layla, closes his eyes, and sighs. He realizes that Layla is right. Nade could indeed be a valuable ally. Reflecting on previous fights, Abel understands that physical strength could be a crucial asset. Finally, he concedes, telling Nade that she can join the group. Nade cheers, excited to work alongside Abel, Galgo, and Layla. Galgo and Layla are also thrilled to have a new member join their team. The group now consists of Abel, who has the ability to decode magic, Layla, a novice magician, and Galgo, the sharp-witted strategist. The team resumes their journey, following Abel's lead. Together, they travel through various towns and villages, visiting markets to stock up on food and equipment. Galgo can't resist eyeing the food stalls, while Layla chats with the merchants. Along the way, they encounter several monsters and demons. Abel and Layla use their combined skills, magic and physical strength, to handle the threats, while Galgo supports them with his magic. At dusk, the team decides to rest for the night. The moon shines brightly in the sky, and the surroundings are peaceful. They set up camp near a mountain, light a fire, and start cooking dinner. Nade, eager to help, removes her armor to relax and takes charge of preparing the meal. Once the food is ready, she proudly presents the dish to the team, eager for them to taste her cooking. Galgo eagerly digs in, devouring the meal without even chewing. Nade laughs at his enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Abel sits a bit apart from the group, lost in thought. Layla notices his distant demeanor and, concerned, approaches him. She's worried because Abel has been unusually quiet lately. Layla asks Abel about their next target on his list of heroes, those who betrayed him during his 20 years of imprisonment. Abel's expression darkens, and he turns away, silent for a moment as memories of his cruel treatment resurface. After a few moments, Abel reveals that their next target is Lamuro, also known as Mastermind. He explains that Mastermind was a brilliant student at a magical academy, known for his intellect and determination. Though he lacked physical strength, Mastermind excelled at magic, mastering countless spells. Many at the academy admired him, including Abel, though he now speaks with a mix of respect and resentment. Layla, curious, asks Abel to elaborate. Abel lowers his gaze and admits that Mastermind never mocked or abused him. Unlike the others, Mastermind never forced him to do anything, nor did he conduct experiments on him under the guise of training. Abel recalls a day during their journey with the hero team when they were all together. That day, Abel had been tied to a tree, and stones were drawn on the bark, serving as targets for knife practice. The others, Nanoa and Stark, were throwing knives, with one knife landing dangerously close to Abel's face, making him scream in fear. Nanoa, proud of her throw, boasted about hitting the 50-point zone, and Stark praised her. Nanoa smiled and thanked Stark before picking up another knife and caressing its blade. She turned to Mastermind, asking if he wanted to join in the fun. Throughout this, Mastermind had been leaning against the tree, reading a book, uninterested in the others' cruel games. Mastermind declined Nanoa's offer, smiling and saying that he preferred to continue reading his book, which he found far more interesting than throwing knives. Stark rolled his eyes, calling Mastermind boring for choosing books over their knife game. Aiden, meanwhile, stood by quietly, not wanting to draw any attention to himself. Abel, horrified, had watched everything unfold. Mastermind's disinterest in the torment made him different from the rest, yet Abel couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Now, as they prepare to face Mastermind, Abel is torn between his respect for the man's intelligence and the need for revenge for his past suffering. I was sweating profusely from the effort, and even more so when I heard Stark say something about Aiden. Aiden couldn't deny it, and Gordon laughed at his reaction. Abel looked directly at Mastermind and, in that moment, saw Mastermind's gaze fixed on him. There was no smile, no expression of contempt or pity. He simply stared. During battles, Mastermind would cross his fingers and cast magic to strike the monsters. He always had a book in hand and never seemed to struggle during fights. While the other heroes fought their own battles, Mastermind would observe them, especially Stark, and take notice of things no one else did. But nobody knew what exactly he was noticing. He either watched his book or what was happening around him. He never seemed impressed. Quite the opposite, it was as if he didn't care. Abel realized that Mastermind always had that look, distant, as if he didn't consider the others his equals. Abel explains that Mastermind didn't just think this way about him. He saw the entire hero group this way. He preferred to keep his distance, never joining in their games or conversations. Abel admits that he knows very little about Mastermind, who always seemed like a mysterious figure, hard to understand, always distant, and quiet around Abel. Their only interactions were fleeting glances, nothing more. Layla listened quietly, feeling pity for Abel. She couldn't believe he had gone through something so terrible. She also didn't understand why Mastermind remained so distant, wondering if perhaps he could have helped Abel. Suddenly, Nade stood up and screamed in a hoarse, worried voice, startling Abel. He looked at her, puzzled, as Nade quickly placed a plate of food in his hand, urging him to eat. Abel refused, but Nade, frustrated, demanded to know why he wouldn't eat her food. Abel, serious and frowning, bluntly stated that he didn't want to eat it because Nade wasn't a good cook. The girl immediately shouted in outrage, asking how Abel dared insult her cooking. She insisted that she was a great cook. Everyone had told her so. Abel, unimpressed, retorted that the people from her kingdom probably didn't have taste buds. Layla jumped up, trying to calm the situation, while Galgo, already on his second portion, rubbed his neck and joked that it was better than the leftovers he had eaten before. He said Nade's cooking tasted similar to those leftovers. This only ignited the argument further, as Nade yelled that Galgo was lying and refused to accept any criticism of her cooking. Abel shouted back, accusing Nade of not having any taste. Galgo, trying to mediate, claimed that the majority was always right. Layla, watching her friends argue, stood silently for a moment before stepping in to mediate. She suggested they all just talk it out. But suddenly, a plate of food went flying through the air and hit Layla square in the face, covering her in sauce and vegetables. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Layla, now with food dripping from her hair and clothes. Layla, growing visibly furious, became quiet and cold. Her anger boiled over, and with a commanding voice, she demanded that everyone calm down immediately. She was like a furious dragon, ready to breathe fire. Everyone froze in fear. Abel, terrified, smiled nervously, while Galgo was so shocked he couldn't even close his mouth. Abel and Nade, realizing how serious Layla was, quickly dropped their weapons. Layla had never been this angry before. She ordered everyone to sit down and calm themselves, and they immediately knelt, lowering their heads in submission. Layla chastised them, pointing out that their shouting could attract monsters from the forest. She then told Nade that she needed to improve her cooking skills and ordered Galgo to control his temper. Galgo, still shaken, saluted and promised to follow Layla's instructions. Turning to Abel, Layla sternly told him that it was important to eat, so he had to eat the meal Nade had prepared. Abel, caught off guard by Layla's forceful tone, was confused. He had never seen her so angry. Though afraid to refuse, Abel decided that, for his own safety, he'd better eat the food. Begrudgingly, he ate the meal while Nade and Galgo watched, stunned that Layla had managed to get Abel to comply. Despite his grim expression, Abel finished his plate and thanked Nade for the food. Layla immediately softened, her anger melting away as she returned to her usual cheerful self. She smiled sweetly, placing her hands on her hips, and praised Abel for eating everything. Nade, still in shock, watched wide-eyed as Layla and Abel's dynamic unfolded. Galgo sat down beside her, smiling broadly. Nade, still processing the scene, turned to Abel and asked why he always listened to Layla. Both Layla and Abel turned toward Nade, equally puzzled by her question. They stood there for a moment, wondering if Abel's deference to Layla was because they had known each other for a long time. Nade stepped back, thinking that maybe it was just Layla's way. She laughed and suggested that Abel had simply become more compliant over time. She assured Layla that she should talk to him more often to get him to open up or at least listen. Abel, his eyes widening in realization, noted that he had indeed become more compassionate compared to his past self. Without realizing it, he had begun to genuinely travel alongside his companions. Looking around, he saw Nade smiling warmly, Galgo now closer to Layla, who was no longer afraid of him. Abel couldn't help but feel that things had truly changed. Layla raised her hands and asked what Nade was talking about, saying that Abel seemed to be more cheerful lately. Abel, meanwhile, reflected on his past companions from the hero group with whom he had once sought to defeat the Demon King. He still couldn't decide if he himself was bad or good. Without realizing it, Abel began to smile at the thought of how comfortable he felt with his new companions. He rubbed his neck, trying to hide his smile, even though his thoughts made him warm inside. Looking over at Galgo, he muttered something to Layla, who now seemed a bit anxious, while Nade simply smiled and laughed. That's how another night of their journey together passed. By morning, the group was preparing to move on. Abel led his companions through the dark forest, where shadows loomed everywhere. Crows perched on the branches, watching the travelers. One crow, named Bacala, cawed, causing all the birds to suddenly fly away. Galgo was startled by Bacala's appearance. Nade approached Abel, expressing concern that the forest didn't feel quite right. Suddenly, Layla stopped and asked the others to do the same. She gazed ahead nervously and questioned if they were heading in the right direction. Abel paused as well, looking somberly at the settlement they had reached. Layla wondered if this was truly where Mastermind lived, finding it hard to believe. The village, called Tirna, appeared abandoned, with decrepit houses and broken fences. Long, bare tree branches stretched everywhere, giving it an eerie atmosphere. Abel told them to keep moving. As they passed through the settlement, the villagers, dressed in white, stared at them suspiciously. They whispered to each other, closing doors as Abel's group passed by. Galgo grew irritated by the villagers' reactions, placing his hands on his hips and asking why they were being stared at like bandits or monsters. Layla also noticed the distrustful glances. Abel raised his hand, reminding himself not to get distracted. His inner voice told him that there had to be a mastermind in this settlement, the very one he sought revenge against. Clenching his fist, Abel repeated to himself that he needed to take revenge on this aggressor in order to move forward toward his ultimate goal of defeating the true defender. As Abel and his companions continued walking, a hidden figure observed them from a distance. Suddenly, Abel's vision darkened, and he began to lose consciousness. Without warning, he collapsed to the ground. Everyone stopped, astonished and unsure of what had just happened. Galgo's mouth hung open in disbelief, and he flinched, confused. Layla, concerned, rushed over to Abel. Nade, too, was in shock, but after a moment, she snapped out of it and rushed to Abel's side to see what was wrong. Layla knelt down in front of him while Galgo anxiously looked around, unsure of what to do. Abel lay motionless, unresponsive to their calls. Blood began to flow from somewhere, adding to the panic. Galgo and Layla worked quickly, trying to understand what had happened, while Nade drew her sword, ready for any threat. Galgo, still in disbelief, asked if Abel had really died, while Nade began to scream, exclaiming that something was definitely wrong with him. Layla, however, kept her composure. She instructed them to calm down, reminding them that their first priority was to get Abel to a safe place, especially since they didn't know who had attacked him. Nade and Galgo immediately composed themselves and followed Layla's lead. Nade understood what needed to be done. She lifted Abel onto her back and carried him as the group hurried to find shelter. Layla, walking beside them, kept an eye on Abel, relieved to feel his breath. It was clear he was still alive, just unconscious. For now, they needed to find a safe place to regroup. Nade led the group to the nearest tavern, spotting its sign as they approached. She carried Abel inside, while Galgo and Layla strategized their next steps. They carefully laid Abel on a bed, with Layla pulling up the blankets. Abel remained unconscious, and Layla's worry deepened. She couldn't understand what had caused him to collapse so suddenly, nor who might have attacked them. As they tended to Abel, a young man stood at the door of the room, smiling. He had been the one who offered them the room and provided everything they needed. He seemed friendly enough, and the girls thanked him for his hospitality. Once they were settled in, the young man sat down and, when asked about Abel's condition, he remarked that it didn't seem like Abel would regain consciousness anytime soon. He couldn't understand why the girls were so worried, but Layla, bowing her head, admitted that they still hadn't figured out how to help him. This left her feeling helpless and frustrated. Galgo was sitting next to Abel, looking at him with concern. Frustrated, she gently tapped his face, hoping to wake him up, but nothing happened. Growing more impatient, she started slapping him harder, but still, Abel didn't stir. Finally, in a burst of frustration, Galgo bit Abel's hand, trying to shock him awake, but there was no reaction. reaction. Layla quickly intervened, slapping Galgo on the head and demanding that she stop. Nade then asked if it could have been a magical attack, raising the possibility since they hadn't noticed or felt anything unusual when Abel collapsed. She reasoned that Abel wouldn't have lost consciousness so suddenly without some cause. Layla, recalling how Abel always protected himself with magic during battles, pointed out that he wouldn't have been taken down by a simple magic attack. She remembered when he had used magical seals to defend himself against a witch's arrow. Nate suggested it might have been a physical attack, but quickly dismissed the idea, noting that Abel had no visible wounds or bruises. Frustrated and confused, she admitted that she couldn't figure out what could have caused this. As they stood over Abel, still unconscious, his face looked peaceful, as if he were merely asleep. But Layla knew something was wrong. Clenching her fists in frustration, she thought back to a moment when Abel had finally smiled, a rare occasion during one of their campfires when Nade had made him laugh despite his usual reluctance. She had hoped that this moment of joy meant he was beginning to let go of the heavy burden of revenge that weighed on his heart. Now, standing by his bedside, Layla, Nade, and Galgo had no more ideas on what had happened to Abel or how to help him. They were at a dead end. Layla, determined, turned to her companions. First, she looked at Galgo, then at Nade, and told them that they had no choice but to help Abel. Nade smiled, admiring Layla's resolve. She and Galgo both agreed that they needed to do whatever they could to aid Abel. After all, apart from them, Abel had no one else. Galgo, thinking hard, raised his hand and suggested that with his keen sense of smell, he could track down the person responsible for putting Abel in this state. Nade, however, pointed out the flaw in his plan. How would Galgo know who to track if they didn't even know the culprit? Galgo, realizing his mistake, looked downcast, but Layla suddenly had an idea. She theorized that the culprit was most likely Mastermind. It made sense given the circumstances, and besides, Abel didn't have sworn enemies other than Mastermind. Layla reasoned that since this was their first time in the settlement, Mastermind must have seen Abel as a threat and decided to strike first, using stealth. Nade looked at Layla, amazed by her calm and rational thinking. Layla, once so emotional and vulnerable, was now analyzing the situation with sharp clarity. Suddenly, Galgo, noticing Layla's unusual behavior, asked a question no one expected. "Are you in love with Abel? Is that why you're trying so hard to save him?" Layla was taken aback, staring at Galgo in shock. She stammered for a few moments, then exploded, asking how Galgo could say something like that. She quickly pointed out that they were all members of the same team, and her actions were purely out of concern for Abel's well-being. Galgo cut her off, grinning, and said that Layla wasn't the only one who cared for Abel. Layla fell silent, stunned by his words. Galgo continued, explaining that Abel had saved her too, and because of that, she also cared deeply for him. She was sure that Nade felt the same way. After all, Abel had played an important role in all their lives. Nade, chiming in, admitted that while she didn't voice it often, Abel had indeed helped her in significant ways, especially during the defense of the fortress against the Demon King's army. Despite his cold demeanor and obsession with revenge, Abel had done a lot for them. Layla smiled, heartened by her companion's support. Together, they resolved to save Abel. Now it was up to them to take care of him. Layla and Galgo donned their cloaks and set out to find the culprit, while Nade stayed behind at the tavern to watch over Abel. He remained unconscious, unaware of how hard his companions were working to save him. Meanwhile, in another dimension or space, Abel's body was wrapped in glowing chains of magic. He was enveloped in total darkness, with nothing around him except these chains binding his arms and legs. Slowly, Abel regained consciousness, but not in the real world. His head throbbed, his mind was foggy, and he could neither see nor hear anything, leaving him disoriented and confused. Abel tried to shake his hand to activate his deciphering ability, but nothing happened. The ability to decipher was the key part of his skill set, and without it, he felt helpless. He realized he wouldn't be able to get out of this situation on his own, but he didn't know what else to do. Time seemed to blur, and he couldn't tell how long he had been trapped. It felt as if he were back in the stone, unable to move or make sense of his surroundings. Time had stopped for him, or maybe it didn't exist at all. The thought of being trapped in the stone again sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't want to relive that experience, which filled him with terror. Abel remembered the overwhelming despair he felt when his hero companions abandoned him, leaving him alone in the field. Meanwhile, Layla and Galgo were walking through the city streets, searching for Mastermind. They suspected he was behind Abel's sudden collapse. Mastermind was the second-to-last hero on Abel's list for revenge. After gathering information, they made their way to a two-story White House that many residents had spoken about. It didn't look much better than the other buildings in the settlement, but it was their lead. As they approached the house, a man in glasses and a white coat greeted them at the door. He smiled warmly and seemed friendly. He asked if they had come to see Mastermind and proudly explained how much Mastermind had done for the settlement. According to him, Mastermind had become a revered figure, almost worshipped by the locals. The man sang Mastermind's praises, calling him a unique and exceptional person, and tried to convince the girls of his greatness. Layla and Galgo exchanged glances but remained silent, listening to the man's glowing comments. Layla grew tense as the man assured them that Mastermind would definitely help with any problem they had. As Layla looked around, she began to suspect that this man had turned Mastermind into some kind of cult leader. People in white coats wandered everywhere, constantly praising Mastermind and discussing his greatness. The man turned toward the door and offered to take Layla and Galgo to meet Mastermind. He mentioned that many people had come through those doors seeking his help and smiled, gesturing for them to enter. He noticed the girls hesitating but didn't pressure them. Layla and Galgo exchanged concerned looks. Galgo leaned toward Layla and asked what they should do. Layla, though wary, said they didn't have much choice. If they wanted to wake Abel, they had to see Mastermind. As they peered inside the house, they overheard two men in white tunics whispering to each other. The men were speaking loudly enough that Layla could hear snippets of their conversation. The two men were laughing, joking about how the girls would likely be taken to see Mastermind. One of them said that only the elite were allowed into Mastermind's inner circle and that he only chose the strongest and most capable. The other added that if they weren't chosen, they would be made into slaves for the Demon King's army. Galgo immediately sprang into action, pushing Layla away from the door and shouting her name. Layla, confused, asked what was going on, having not overheard the conversation. Galgo urged her to run, and both girls fled from the house, covering their faces. The man at the door tried calling after them, reaching out with his hand, but the girls were already far ahead. As they ran, Galgo replayed the conversation in his mind, horrified at the thought of people being enslaved by the Demon King's forces. He began to realize that this settlement was far more dangerous than they had initially thought. He feared that they could become slaves to the Demon King themselves, preventing them from ever saving Abel. Galgo and Layla hadn't suspected that Mastermind was working with the Demon King. They had hoped that the villagers simply admired him, but now they understood that Mastermind was just as terrible as the other figures Abel had spoken about. At that moment, inside the house, Mastermind was dining with guests from the Demon King's army on the upper floor. The large room was filled with delicious food spread across a long table. As they ate, Mastermind thought about Abel, dismissing him as a useless member of the hero group. No one had ever understood why Abel had been chosen. Mastermind thanked one of his guests for the information provided by the Demon King's army, which had allowed him to locate Abel and neutralize him quickly. He was thinking about Abel, but didn't realize that the man was already close. At the far end of the table sat Jamie, who was casually eating a chicken thigh. She ate quickly, barely paying attention to the conversation. Jamie was bored, her legs crossed on the table as she stared off into the distance. She made a snide comment, saying that while she had provided the information about Abel, the process was dull and uninspiring. Jamie hated boredom. Mastermind smiled at Jamie, then asked her if the Demon King's army was satisfied with his loyalty. For years, Mastermind had been enslaving people and weakening the human threat for the Demon King. He believed that he had done enough to earn a significant reward and hoped he could negotiate for a promotion. Adjusting his glasses, he asked Jamie if it was time for him to work side by side with the Demon King himself. Mastermind believed he had done enough for the Demon King to deserve a place among his closest advisors. Hami, however, took her time to respond, clearly unimpressed. She finally said that perhaps the Demon King would consider his request, but made it clear that she didn't decide anything. In truth, Hami was bored with Mastermind, and it showed in her demeanor. Mastermind began to get frustrated by her indifferent reactions. A vein throbbed in his forehead as his anger grew. He had invested so much time and effort into pleasing the Demon King, and now Hami was dismissing him. Suddenly, he stood up, catching Hami's attention. He declared that it might be time for her to move aside and let him rise higher. Hami watched him intently, sensing his rising anger. A dark aura began to surround him. Raising his hand, Mastermind asked if Hami was ready to step aside for him. He didn't see this as a mere challenge, but as his right. Hami, still calmly eating, smiled like a predator. She didn't expect Mastermind to have the audacity to confront her, but she found it amusing. Deciding to accept the challenge, Hami spread her wings and launched herself into the air above the table. The sudden gust from her wings sent dishes and food flying, causing a commotion. Mastermind remained standing, watching as Hami created a whirlwind. The noise drew the attention of the other inhabitants of the house, and they rushed in to check on their guru. They were concerned for his safety, as they could hear the chaos from outside. One of the men burst into the room, apologizing for the interruption, but was quickly cut off by Hami. She turned to Mastermind and coldly informed him that she would never give him what he wanted, not in this lifetime. Hami had her own plans, not only for Abel but also for Mastermind. Mastermind, displeased by the outcome, lowered his head in frustration. He had hoped to continue his rise in the Demon King's ranks, to gain immense power and influence. Silently fuming, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He decided to leave the conversation for another time, perhaps when he had a better plan. First, however, he needed to deal with Abel and his companions. Hami, now standing calmly on the floor, began to hum a cheerful tune. Her mood lifted as she thought about Abel still trapped and chained. Feeling that her business with Mastermind was done, she unfurled her wings once more and flew off, eager for what she believed would be an entertaining turn of events. Meanwhile, in the settlement, the streets were quiet except for the cawing of crows. The houses looked weathered and in disrepair. This was the same settlement where Abel and his companions, Nade and Galgo, were staying. A young boy was sweeping near the entrance of the tavern when he noticed Layla and Galgo approaching. He greeted them warmly and offered to escort them back to their room. As they climbed the stairs, the boy, curious, asked if it was true that they had fought against the Demon King and the Kingdom of Claymore. Layla hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer, but eventually confirmed that they had indeed battled the Demon King. The boy was excited and expressed his admiration for their bravery, continuing to ask questions about their adventures as they neared the room. When the boy opened the door, he froze in shock, staring at the scene inside. Galgo, too, was taken aback, his eyes widening in disbelief. Layla, who had been laughing moments before, stopped as she realized something was wrong. The room was filled with people dressed in white, surrounding Nade, who was trying to defend herself. One of the men was attempting to pull her shield away, while others jostled to get their weapons out. Nade, who had been protecting Abel while waiting for Layla and Galgo, was now fighting off the intruders. She wasn't about to let them harm Abel, so as soon as Layla and Galgo entered the room, they immediately joined the fight. It became clear that the attackers were servants of Mastermind, intent on defending their leader. One of the men drew a dagger, declaring that they were doing all of this for the good of their lord, Mastermind. He vowed that they would fight anyone who stood in the way of their leader's protection, no matter who it was. The boy at the door, confused and terrified, shouted, asking what was happening. Just moments ago, everything had been calm, and now a battle had erupted. The people in white tried to strike at Layla and Galgo, but the girls skillfully dodged or blocked the attacks. Galgo darted from one opponent to another, her claws slashing through the air. Nade fiercely defended herself with her shield, blocking strikes from multiple attackers who barely had time to draw their swords. Layla, unprepared for the sudden fight, barely dodged an attacker who lunged at her. She screamed and jumped back, overwhelmed. Nade, hearing Layla's cry, turned and shouted at her to get into position and start defending herself. Layla, still shaken, struggled to get her bearings as she was surrounded by multiple opponents. In the midst of the chaos, the attackers shouted about their loyalty to Mastermind and how they would not stop until their mission was complete. Layla and her companions, however, were determined to protect Abel and fend off the servants, no matter the cost. Layla quickly grabbed the boy, who was alarmed by the battle unfolding in the tavern. She didn't want to abandon her comrades, hoping to stay and be useful in the fight. But then a thought struck her. How had Mastermind's people entered the tavern so easily? It dawned on her. The boy must have let them in. Suspicion grew as Layla realized something wasn't right. How could the boy have known about their battle in the other kingdom? There was no way he could have found out from the locals. Layla froze as the boy's face shifted from fear to a sly, happy expression. He mocked her, commenting on her strange look. In the blink of an eye, the boy shed his disguise. He was Mastermind all along. No one had suspected it. Smiling, Mastermind admitted that they would have discovered the truth eventually. He never planned to stay hidden for long because he needed to act. Layla, stunned by the revelation, couldn't believe they had been fooled so easily, leading Abel straight into the enemy's hands. Mastermind placed his hand over his chest, smiling with a mock bow, introducing himself as an old comrade of the useless Abel. Nade and Galgo, hearing the commotion, turned around and were equally shocked to see Mastermind standing there. The three of them were baffled at how they had failed to notice that their enemy was right in front of them. Mastermind applauded, appreciating the girl's surprise. He mused aloud about what it means to be a comrade, someone strong, someone worthy of fighting beside you. He went on to say that he had neutralized Abel to test the girls, to see what they were capable of. The girls glanced at Abel, still unconscious, worry clear on their faces. Mastermind pointed at Layla, praising her logic and judgment, calling them valuable traits. He extended his hand, inviting her to join him, suggesting it was the best choice for someone like like her. Layla trembled with anger. The audacity of Mastermind offering her to leave her comrades behind infuriated her. He spoke of carefully selecting only the elite to join his ranks, offering her wealth and power if she joined him. But Layla refused, shouting that she would never be bribed with sweet promises or money. She would never betray her friends. Mastermind, taken aback, didn't understand how anyone could reject his offer. He had been certain that anyone would accept such a deal. Layla, her voice filled with determination, told Mastermind that she could never forgive him for what he had done to Abel and her comrades. She didn't need comrades like him. Furious, Mastermind clicked his fingers and coldly declared that if she wouldn't join him, she didn't deserve to live. He had hoped she wouldn't be so concerned about someone as useless as Abel, but now he would find someone else to take her place. At Mastermind's command, his henchmen appeared, ready to capture Layla and the others. Armed with wooden sticks, they surrounded the girls, eager to carry out their orders. Mastermind then activated his magic, forming seals to unleash powerful spells. The force of his magic was overwhelming, shattering the walls of the tavern and sending the girls flying backward from the sheer pressure. Layla crashed to the ground at the feet of Mastermind's acolytes, screaming in pain. She tried to stand but was too weak, groaning in agony. The acolytes advanced toward her, ready to capture her. But before they could reach her, Nade rushed in, standing in front of Layla with her shield raised. Despite the force of the earlier explosion, Nade held firm, blocking the acolytes' blows. They demanded that she join them, promising survival if she did. But Nade resisted with all her strength. Despite the odds, Nade continued to defend Layla and Galgo, who remained unconscious from the impact. The acolytes began to surround Galgo, but she hadn't recovered from her fall. Nade, exhausted and desperate, clung to her shield, blocking each strike. She looked around and saw Abel still lying on the ground, unconscious. She didn't know how to turn the tide of the battle, as Mastermind's forces seemed unstoppable. From his vantage point, Mastermind watched Nade struggling, a cruel smile on his face. Confident in his victory, he declared that no one could break through his magic. He believed that he had already won. Layla, slowly regaining consciousness, tried to rise and act, but her body wouldn't respond. She thought of Abel, lying helpless on the ground, unable to defend himself. With her last bit of strength, she attempted to stand, but darkness overtook her. The last thing Layla saw before losing consciousness again was Mastermind's smug grin as he reached out toward her, fully confident in his impending victory. Mastermind was surrounded by his servants, leaving Layla unable to figure out where Abel was. Meanwhile, Abel's body was still tightly bound by chains, preventing him from doing anything. In front of him, a massive spell formula loomed on a screen. Abel struggled tirelessly to decipher the spell and free himself, but it was a slow process. His breath came in ragged gasps as desperation set in. He had spent what felt like an eternity in this space, trying to break free from Mastermind's magic, but he refused to accept a lifetime of imprisonment. Suddenly, Abel heard the fluttering of wings. At first, he thought he was imagining things. He had been alone for so long. But no, he wasn't alone. For a moment, he wondered if he had lost his mind from being trapped here. Still, he looked toward the sound, curious to see what was there. To his surprise, he saw someone he hadn't expected, Hami, the general of the Demon King's army. She floated in the air before him, her hands behind her back, smiling as she gazed at him, trapped and chained. She seemed amused to find him in this state, pleased that Mastermind had done his job well. For her, this was a chance to have some fun. Abel, startled, wondered how she had invaded his space. Before he could ask, Hami cut him off, teasing him for wanting to know how she entered his spiritual realm. She laughed, calling him not very smart for still not understanding what was happening. With a mocking grin, she warned Abel that if he didn't act soon, he would lose everything he held dear. With a flick of her hand, a screen appeared before him. As the screen came into focus, Abel's eyes widened in shock. He saw Nade desperately defending Layla with her shield as Mastermind's acolytes attacked relentlessly. Layla was in bad shape, fighting with everything she had left. The girls were outnumbered and overwhelmed, an unfair battle against Mastermind's many servants. Abel's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't bear seeing them suffer, and what hurt him most was that he was powerless to help. Hami leaned in closer, whispering in his ear, taunting him. She told him that the girls, who had sworn to help others, were now suffering because of his obsession with revenge. If he continued down this path, they might lose their lives because of him. Her words stoked the anger simmering inside Abel, but despite his growing rage, he couldn't act. The sight of his comrades being beaten tortured him. He had sought revenge, but he never wanted those close to him, Layla, Galgo, Nade, to suffer because of it. Hami, still smiling, asked if he wanted to save them. She urged him to act before it was too late, telling him to free himself. Abel struggled against the chains, his arms arms and legs shaking as he fought to break free. Hami continued to egg him on, telling him to try harder. Frustration and desperation filled Abel, and he screamed with all the strength he had left, either from the hopelessness of his situation or the rising fury within him. But then he stopped. He slumped forward, head bowed, and fell silent, defeated. Seeing this, Hami sighed and taunted him again, calling him useless. She reminded him of his 20 years of imprisonment, of how nothing had changed. She told him that he had always been weak and pathetic. Hami smirked, bringing up the memories of how his former comrades had used him and then abandoned him. She continued to provoke him, saying that revenge was the only reason he had survived this long. It was the fire that kept him going, the only thing keeping him alive. Suddenly, something clicked inside Abel. His eyes snapped open as if realizing something profound. A spark ignited within him, a small flame that began to grow. Hami's words had struck a chord, and he finally understood that revenge had driven him all along. It was the thought of getting even that had kept him moving forward. He didn't need comrades, friends, or joy. All he needed was to find his enemies and take his revenge. As this realization washed over him, the flame inside him grew stronger, burning brighter. His eyes opened wide, and dark liquid began to seep from them, covering his face. The sight was terrifying. Abel didn't look like himself anymore. A dark aura began to swirl around him, much like the ominous aura of the Demon King. The darkness engulfed him, feeding on his rage. Hami, watching this transformation, was delighted. She had known that pushing him to his breaking point would unleash something powerful. Her encounter with Mastermind had left her angry, so she had decided to visit Abel, knowing that in this state no one, not even Mastermind, could stop him. The dark aura spread across the entire space, consuming the screen with the spell formula and the chains that held Abel captive. Everything was swallowed by the void of darkness. Hami and Abel both vanished from sight as if they had never been there. Suddenly, the pitch-black space was illuminated by glowing fairies that appeared out of nowhere, casting light over the once dark area. The fairies appeared as small spirits, fluttering through the darkness, casting light wherever they went. They glowed softly until a massive white snake with red eyes suddenly appeared, opening its mouth wide and lunging toward them. The fairies barely had time to react before they were swallowed whole by the giant serpent. At that moment, a hand emerged from the darkness, Abel's hand. He swung his arm abruptly, directing a burst of magic toward Hami, the general of the Demon King's army. Shock registered on Hami's face as half of her body vanished from the impact, leaving a gaping emptiness where her torso had been. As her body began to disappear piece by piece, Hami burst into wild laughter. She marveled at Abel's newfound power, thrilled by the outcome of her provocative words. She hadn't expected her taunting to have such a powerful effect, but she was delighted with the result. Even as her body faded, she smiled, knowing that her words had awakened something terrifying in Abel. Hami realized it was time to leave, but she was pleased with how things had turned out. The dark aura around Abel had transformed him into a terrifying, ruthless creature, consumed by his desire for revenge. At that moment, nothing else mattered to him. Revenge was his sole purpose. Meanwhile, Abel lay unconscious on the tavern floor, surrounded by the wreckage of the building. The others were nowhere to be seen, as if they had abandoned him. Then suddenly, Abel's eyes snapped open. Wide-eyed, he scanned his surroundings, his mind fixated on one goal, finding Mastermind. If he didn't, he feared he would lose control, consumed by his need for revenge. Just as Abel began to move, an explosion erupted behind Mastermind, shattering the tavern's roof. Mastermind didn't immediately turn around. He heard the loud bang and sensed the danger, knowing full well that Abel was the cause. Slowly, Mastermind turned, confused as to how Abel had gained such power and destroyed the roof so easily. Abel walked out of the wreckage, his steps firm and filled with purpose. Darkness swirled around him like a shroud. His body was tense, his muscles rigid with rage. There was no hesitation in his movements. He had no intention of speaking with Mastermind, nor did he plan to forgive him. When Abel stopped in front of Mastermind, the villain called out to him, trying to understand how Abel had escaped the trap he'd been so sure would hold him. Layla, still on the ground, watched the scene in horror. Abel's appearance was terrifying, a dark aura extending from his body, casting shadows all around him. His eyes were filled with malice, and he looked more like a predator stalking its prey than a man. Even Layla, his ally, felt fear when she saw him. Mastermind took a closer look at Abel and noticed the dark energy surrounding him. It was stronger than anything Mastermind had seen before. The fact that Abel had broken free of the seal was alarming. He wondered if Abel had somehow mastered the magic of destruction, something that matched the dark aura now enveloping him. The fear in Mastermind's eyes was palpable, and his disciples felt it too. They quickly gathered around their leader, preparing preparing to defend him. Abel, now radiating power, raised his hand and pointed at Mastermind, declaring that this would be the villain's last day alive. His aggression was palpable, his resolve unshakable. Mastermind, backing away in fear, realized that he and his henchmen were in serious danger. He hadn't anticipated this level of power from Abel, and now he needed a new strategy to survive. Mastermind's disciples charged at Abel, hoping to overwhelm him with their numbers. They believed that together they could defeat him. However, Abel remained unfazed. As the disciples rushed toward him, Abel moved with lightning speed, folding a seal and casting a petrification spell. In an instant, many of Mastermind's followers froze, their bodies turning to stone. Abel showed no mercy. He dodged the strikes from the remaining disciples and continued to cast the petrification spell on anyone who crossed his path. The disciples had no time to react, dropping their weapons in an attempt to stop the inevitable, but it was useless. One by one, they were turned to stone. Nade, who had been tending to Layla, helped her to her feet. She was worried about Abel's transformation. It frightened her. Layla, still recovering, looked at Abel with fear in her eyes. He was cutting down opponents with ease, using his petrification spell to eliminate them in seconds. Nade and Layla couldn't understand why the villagers kept advancing on Abel, seemingly oblivious to how dangerous he had become. They were devoted to Mastermind, but their blind loyalty was leading them to their doom. One of the villagers stood frozen among his comrades, who had already been turned to stone. He watched in horror as Abel moved swiftly through the crowd, trying to comprehend how Abel had gained such power, how he was able to wield the Demon King's magic. But he had no time to think. Abel grabbed the villager by the hood and yanked him forward, determined to destroy anything that stood in his way. Abel stared at the villager, his gaze cold and unrelenting. Raising his hand, he revealed the spell he intended to use. The villager, terrified, saw the resemblance between Abel and the Demon King. But before he could react, Abel turned him into stone. As the last villager fell, petrified, Mastermind approached Abel, speaking as if they were old acquaintances. Mastermind remarked how quickly the 20 years had passed and admitted he hadn't expected to see Abel again. He mockingly complimented Abel, acknowledging that he had fought well for someone with so few skills, but still referred to him as weak and useless, as he had in the past. Raising his hand to show the seal, Mastermind reminded Abel that they were both spiritual magicians. With a dark smile, he challenged Abel to a personal duel, confident in his victory, believing Abel would be weakened after the earlier battle. Abel, however, met Mastermind's gaze with determination. He wasn't going to back down. The job wasn't finished yet. Mastermind quickly formed a seal and unleashed his magic, directing multiple elements and spells at Abel, believing he couldn't withstand such an assault. But Abel calmly raised his hand, creating a shield that blocked the attacks. The shield resembled a screen, absorbing the impact of the spells, leaving Abel untouched as he waited for Mastermind to finish. Mastermind, stunned by Abel's defense, began to realize that the battle might already be lost. Abel, standing before him, had been silently deciphering Mastermind's spells during the attack. As soon as Mastermind's magic ceased, Abel unleashed the same spells back at him, rapidly forming seals. In a panic, Mastermind crossed his arms, forming a protective sphere around himself, hoping for a chance to counterattack. He was surprised by how quickly Abel had deciphered one of his most powerful spells, a spell that even Mastermind found difficult to use. Despite his protection, Mastermind felt the force of Abel's magic and realized that his ordinary spells weren't enough. He needed a new strategy, something unique. Mastermind relied on his spiritual magic, believing it was invincible. Confident once more, he raised his hand and pointed at Abel, activating another spell. Abel appeared to be affected, his head lowered, arms hanging limp by his sides, as if he had succumbed to the magic. Mastermind smiled, thinking he had regained control, believing Abel would now be a prisoner once again, just as when he first arrived in the settlement. Layla, watching from the ground, was horrified, fearing Abel was being trapped again. She could do nothing but watch as chains began to form around Abel's wrists. But Abel abruptly raised his hand and shattered the chains before they could fully bind him. He inspected his hand, ensuring everything was in order, then looked at Mastermind with cold indifference. Mastermind, baffled, couldn't comprehend how Abel had broken free so easily. Abel casually rubbed his neck and asked what all of this was about, seemingly unfazed. He questioned why Mastermind was still resisting. Mastermind, now terrified, stepped back, cursing Abel and telling him to stay away. Abel continued to advance, his dark aura growing more intense. Mastermind, desperate, raised his hand to cast another spell, but a chain suddenly appeared on his own wrist. Shocked, Mastermind stared at the chain, unable to understand how Abel had managed to place a seal on his spiritual magic. His acolytes were equally stunned. They had never seen seen their leader overpowered like this. Nade and Layla, watching from the sidelines, were in disbelief. It seemed impossible, but they now realized Abel had already won. Mastermind's magic had been neutralized, and he was defenseless. Abel raised his fist, showing the seal on the back of his hand, signaling that he was serious about finishing Mastermind off. Mastermind, filled with fear, clenched his hand, realizing that the seal on his spiritual magic meant his defeat was inevitable. Without his magic, he was powerless. Physical strength had never been his forte. Suddenly, Abel struck him with a powerful punch, sending Mastermind reeling. His glasses shattered, and he hit the ground hard, struggling to comprehend the force of the blow. Mastermind lay on the ground, dazed, as Abel struck him again, sending him flying across the room. Despite the beating, Mastermind refused to admit defeat, though he knew he couldn't fight back. Abel continued to land blow after blow, taking brief pauses in between. Each punch was more powerful than the last, leaving Mastermind helpless. Mastermind, now looking at Abel with horror, began to wonder how Abel had deciphered his spell so effortlessly. He had been convinced that his spiritual magic was far superior. Then, something seemed to dawn on Mastermind, and he started to smile, though his body was broken and his defeat inevitable. He knew it was over, but in his twisted mind, he admired the monster Abel had become. It seemed that Mastermind had lost his grip on reality. Even as Abel relentlessly hit him, he smiled, his face smeared with blood. After a few moments, Mastermind, through a strained voice, admitted that Abel's spiritual magic was truly remarkable. He acknowledged Abel's strength and, in a surprising turn, declared that he now wanted Abel as his partner. Mastermind reminisced about his past, remembering how the spirits had chosen him, making him special. Since then, everyone had bowed before him, the chosen one. He had always believed that only those with equal strength could stand beside him, while others were mere ants, weak, unworthy. He had never viewed anyone as his equal, but now, as he reflected on Abel, he realized that perhaps Abel had been worthy all along. Mastermind recalled how Abel had been selected as one of the heroes, though at first, he hadn't understood why. But during the Demon King's attack 20 years ago, Mastermind had sensed a dormant power in Abel. Now, seeing Abel's fury unleashed, he understood. Abel, however, was not interested in Mastermind's musings. Fueled by rage, he struck Mastermind's face again and again, right hand, then left, without pause. His anger consumed him, and he couldn't stop. Nade and Layla watched in shock, their expressions frozen in horror. Layla, her voice trembling, pleaded for Abel to stop hitting Mastermind, but Abel didn't listen. Nothing mattered to him now except exacting revenge on the ones who had imprisoned him for 2 decades. Layla could no longer recognize Abel. He was violent, merciless, a shadow of the person she had journeyed with. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him to stop, but Abel was deaf to her pleas. His fists landed with increasing force, and with the final blow, Mastermind, barely conscious, slumped to the ground. Mastermind lay motionless, his body battered and bruised, his glasses shattered. Abel stood over him, his breath ragged. He stared at Mastermind, and then, with cold precision, asked where Stark was, the last hero who had condemned him to 20 years of suffering. Mastermind, struggling to breathe after the beating, sensed his end was near. He realized there was no escape and, with what little strength he had left, told Abel that Stark was trapped by the Demon King, Thanos. Hearing this, Abel, without hesitation, formed a seal and cast the petrification spell on Mastermind. Mastermind, knowing his fate was sealed, tried to plead for mercy. He called out to Abel, insisting they were once friends and trying to convince him not to do this. But Abel didn't listen. Mastermind's body began to turn to stone, his desperate pleas fading as the petrification took hold. As Mastermind was fully encased in stone, Abel, enraged by his final words, raised his foot and brought it down with all his might, shattering the statue of Mastermind into pieces. He stared at the remains with disgust and muttered that he had no need for friends. Abel's twisted understanding of friendship had been shaped by the betrayal of his former comrades 20 years ago. At that moment, Layla called out to Abel, her voice filled with worry. Abel hesitated, unwilling to face her. He knew the decision he had made was one she would not accept. Behind him, Nade held Galgo, who was still unconscious, while Layla, bruised and exhausted, stood watching him. Abel closed his eyes, remembering everything that had happened during their journey together. For some reason, as he prepared to leave them behind, memories flooded his mind. He recalled how Layla had insisted on joining him, full of enthusiasm and determination. He remembered how Galgo had offered to help, and how Abel, who had always loved animals, had accepted. He thought of Nade's promise to stay with him until they defeated the Demon King. They had fought side by side, protecting one another. In those moments, Abel had come to understand what it meant to have true comrades. But the painful memories memories of his former companions. Those who had mocked him and abandoned him lingered. Despite the bonds he had formed with Layla, Galgo, and Nade, Abel had decided to leave. Turning to them with a smile, he told them they would meet again someday. He believed that once he defeated Stark, he could return. But Layla, realizing what was happening, widened her eyes in disbelief. She couldn't accept that Abel was leaving them. Before she could stop him, Abel vanished in an instant, disappearing from sight. Nade and Layla stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Layla fell to her knees, overwhelmed with despair. Nade rushed to her side to comfort her, but the reality was sinking in. Abel was gone. As Galgo began to stir, slowly regaining consciousness, he noticed Layla crying and Nade trying to console her. Outside, the streets were silent. The battle was over, and Abel had left them behind.